The Harbour Master by Robert W. Chambers. Chapter 1. Because it all seems so improbable, so horribly impossible to me now, sitting here safe and sane in my own library, I hesitate to record an episode which already appears to me less horrible than grotesque. Yet, unless this story is written now, I know I shall never have the courage to tell the truth about the matter, not from fear of ridicule, but because I myself shall soon cease to credit what I now know to be true. Yet scarcely a month has elapsed since I heard the stealthy purring of what I believe to be the shoaling undertow. Scarcely a month ago, with my own eyes, I saw that which, even now, I am beginning to believe never existed. As for the harbour master, and the blow I am now striking at the old order of things, but of that I shall not speak now or later. I shall try to tell the story simply and truthfully, and let my friends testify as to my probity, and the publishers of this book corroborate them. On the 29th of February, I resigned my position under the government and left Washington to accept an offer from Professor Farrago, whose name he kindly permits me to use. And on the first day of April, I entered upon my new and congenial duties as General Superintendent of the Waterfowl Department connected with the Zoological Gardens then in course of erection of Bronx Park, New York. For a week I followed the routine, examining the new foundations, studying the architect's plans, following the surveyors through the Bronx thickets, suggesting arrangements for watercourses and pools destined to be included in the enclosures for swans, geese, pelicans, herons, and such of the waders and swimmers as we might expect to acclimate in Bronx Park. It was at that time the policy of the trustees and officers of the Zoological Gardens neither to employ collectors nor to send out expeditions in search of specimens. The society decided to depend upon voluntary contributions, and I was always busy, part of the day, in dictating answers to correspondents who wrote offering their services as hunters of big game, collectors of all sorts of fauna, trappers, snarers, and also to those who offered specimens for sale, usually at exorbitant rates. To the proprietors of five-legged kittens, mangy lynxes, moth-eaten coyotes, and dancing bears, I returned courteous but uncompromising refusals, of course, first submitting all such letters, together with my replies, to Professor Farrago. One day towards the end of May, however, just as I was leaving Bronx Park to return to town, Professor Lassard of the Reptilian Department called out to me that Professor Farrago wanted to see me a moment. So I put my pipe into my pocket again and retraced my steps to the temporary wooden building occupied by Professor Farrago, General Superintendent of the Zoological Gardens. The professor, who was sitting at his desk before a pile of letters and replies submitted for approval by me, pushed his glasses down and looked over them at me with a whimsical smile that suggested amusement, impatience, annoyance, and perhaps a faint trace of apology. "Now here's a letter," he said with a deliberate gesture towards a sheet of paper impaled on a file. "A letter that I suppose you remember." He disengaged the sheet of paper and handed it to me. "Oh yes," I replied with a shrug. "Of course the man is mistaken, or what?" demanded Professor Farrago, tranquilly wiping his glasses. "Or a liar," I replied. After a silence he leaned back in his chair and bade me read the letter to him again, and I did so with a contemptuous tolerance for the writer, who must have been either a very innocent victim or a very stupid swindler. I said as much to Professor Farrago, but, to my surprise, he appeared to waver. "I suppose," he said with his near-sighted, embarrassed smile, "that 999 men in 1,000 would throw that letter aside and condemn the writer as a liar or a fool." "In my opinion," said I, "he's one or the other." "He isn't," in mine," said the professor placidly. "What?" I exclaimed. "Here is a man living all alone on a strip of rock and sand between the wilderness and the sea, who wants you to send somebody to take charge of a bird that doesn't exist." "How do you know," asked Professor Farrago, "that the bird in question does not exist?" "It is generally accepted," I replied sarcastically, "that the great auk has been extinct for years. Therefore, I may be pardoned for doubting that our correspondent possesses a pair of them alive." "Oh, you young fellows," said the professor, smiling wearily. "You embark on a theory for destinations that don't exist." He leaned back in his chair, his amused eyes searching space for the imaginary that made him smile. "Like swimming squirrels, you navigate with the help of heaven and a stiff breeze, but you never land where you hope to, do you?" Rather red in the face, I said, "Don't you believe the great auk to be extinct?" "Audubon saw the great auk." "Who has seen a single specimen since?" "Nobody, except our correspondent here," he laughed. I laughed too, considering the interview at an end, but the professor went on coolly. "Whatever it is that our correspondent has, and I am daring to believe that it is the great auk itself, I want you to secure it for the society." When my astonishment subsided, my first conscious sentiment was one of pity. Clearly, Professor Farrago was on the verge of dotage. Ah, what a loss to the world. I believe now that Professor Farrago perfectly interpreted my thoughts, but he betrayed neither resentment nor impatience. I drew a chair up beside his desk. There was nothing to do but to obey, and this fool's errand was none of my conceiving. Together we made out a list of articles necessary for me and itemised the expenses I might incur, and I set a date for my return, allowing no margin for a successful termination to the expedition. "Never mind that," said the professor. "What I want you to do is get those birds here safely. Now, how many men will you take?" "None," I replied bluntly. "It's a useless expense, unless there is something to bring back. If there is, I'll wire you, you may be sure." "Very well," said Professor Farrago good-humouredly. "You shall have all the assistance you may require. Can you leave tonight?" The old gentleman was certainly prompt. I nodded, half sulkily, aware of his amusement. "So," I said, picking up my hat, "I am to start north to find a place called Black Harbour, where there is a man named Halliard who possesses, among other household utensils, 2 extinct great auks." We were both laughing by this time. I asked him why on earth he credited the assertion of a male he had never before heard of. "I suppose," he replied, with the same half-apologetic, half-humorous smile, "it is instinct. I feel, somehow, that this man Halliard has got an auk, perhaps 2. I can't get away from the idea that we are on the eve of acquiring the rarest of living creatures. It's odd for a scientist to talk as I do. Doubtless you're shocked. Admit it, now." But I was not shocked. On the contrary, I was conscious that the same strange hope that Professor Farrago cherished was beginning, in spite of me, to stir my pulses too. "If he has," I began, then stopped. The professor and I looked hard at each other in silence. "Go on," he said encouragingly. But I had nothing more to say, for the prospect of beholding with my own eyes a living specimen of the great auk produced a series of conflicting emotions within me which rendered speech profanely superfluous. As I took my leave, Professor Farrago came to the door of the temporary wooden office and handed me the letter written by the man Halliard. I folded it and put it into my pocket, as Halliard might require it for my own identification. "How much does he want for the pair?" I asked. $10,000. Don't demur. If the birds are really... I know, I said hastily, not daring to hope too much. One thing more, said Professor Farrago, gravely. You know, in that last paragraph of his letter, Halliard speaks of something else in the way of the specimens. An undiscovered species of amphibious biped. Just read that paragraph again, will you? I drew the letter from my pocket and read as he directed. When you have seen the 2 living specimens of the great auk, and have satisfied yourself that I tell the truth, you may be wise enough to listen without prejudice to a statement I shall make concerning the existence of the strangest creature ever fashioned. I will merely say, at this time, that the creature referred to is an amphibious biped and inhabits the ocean near the coast. More I cannot say, for I personally have not seen the animal, but I have a witness who has, and there are many who affirm that they have seen the creature. You will naturally say that my statement amounts to nothing, but when your representatives arrive, if he be free from prejudice, I expect his reports to you concerning this sea biped will confirm the solemn statements of a witness I know to be unimpeachable. Yours truly, Burton Halliard, Black Harbour. Well, I said after a moment's thought, here goes for the wild goose chase. Wild auk, you mean, said Professor Farrago, shaking hands with me. You will start tonight, won't you? Yes, but heaven knows how I'm ever going to land in this man's Halliard's dooryard. Goodbye. About that sea biped, began Professor Farrago shyly. Oh, don't, I said. I can swallow the auks, feathers and claws, but if this fellow Halliard is hinting he's seen an amphibious creature resembling a man... Or a woman, said the Professor cautiously. I retired disgusted, my faith shaken in the mental vigours of Professor Farrago. Chapter 2. The 3 days' voyage by boat and rail was irksome. I bought my kit at St. Croix on the Central Pacific Railroad, and on June 1st I began the last stage of my journey via the St. Isolde broad gauge, arriving in the wilderness by daylight. A tedious forced march by blazed trail, freshly spotted on the wrong side, of course, brought me to the northern terminus of the rusty, narrow-gauge lumber railway which runs from the heart of the hush pine wilderness to the sea. Already a long train of battered flat cars, piled with sluice props and roughly hewn sleepers, was moving slowly off into the brooding forest gloom when I came in sight of the track. But I developed a gratifying and unexpected burst of speed, shouting all the while. The train stopped. I swung myself aboard the last car, where a pleasant young fellow was sitting on the rear brake, chewing spruce and reading a letter. Come aboard, sir, he said, looking up with a smile. I guess you're the man in a hurry. I'm looking for a man named Halliard, I said, dropping rifle and knapsack on the fresh-cut, fragrant pile of pine. Are you Halliard? No, I'm Francis Lee. Bossing the mica pit of Port of Waves, he replied. But this letter is from Halliard, asking me to look out for a man in a hurry from Bronx Park, New York. I'm that man, said I, filling my pipe and offering him a share of the weed of peace, and we sat side by side smoking very amiably until a signal from the locomotive sent him forward and I was left alone, lounging at ease, head pillowed on both arms, watching the blue sky flying through the branches overhead. Long before we came in sight of the ocean, I smelled it. The fresh, salt aromas stole into my senses, drowsy with the heated odour of pine and hemlock, and I sat up, peering ahead into the dusky sea of pines. Fresher and fresher came the wind from the sea, in puffs, in mild, sweet breezes, in steady, freshening currents, blowing the feathery crowns of the pines, setting the balsam's blue tufts rocking. Lee wandered back over the long line of flats, balancing himself nonchalantly as the cars swung around a sharp curve, where water dripped from a newly propped sluice that suddenly emerged from the depths of the forest to run parallel to the railroad track. "Built in this spring," he said, surveyed his handiwork, which seemed to undulate as the cars swept past. "It runs to the cove, or it ought to." He stopped abruptly with a thoughtful glance at me. "So you're going over to Halliard's?" He continued as though answering a question asked by himself. I nodded. "You've never been there, of course?" "No," I said, "and I'm not likely to go again." I would have told him why I was going if I had not already begun to feel ashamed of my idiotic errand. "I guess you're going to look at those birds of his," continued Lee placidly. "I guess I am," I said sulkingly, glancing askance to see whether he was smiling. But he only asked me, quite seriously, whether a great auk was really a very rare bird. And I told him that the last one ever seen had been found dead off Labrador in January 1870. Then I asked him whether these birds of Halliard's were really great auks, and he replied, somewhat indifferently, that he supposed they were. At least nobody had ever before seen such birds near Port of Waves. "There's something else," he said, running a pine sliver through his pipe stem. "Something that interests us all here more than auks, big or little. I suppose I might as well speak of it, as you are bound to hear about it sooner or later." He hesitated, and I could see that he was embarrassed, searching for the exact words to convey his meaning. "If," said I, "you have anything in this region more important to science than the great auk, I shall be very glad to know about it." Perhaps there was the faintest tinge of sarcasm in my voice, for he shot a sharp glance at me and then turned slightly. After a moment, however, he put his pipe into his pocket, laid hold of the brake with both hands, vaulted to his perch aloft, and glanced down at me. "Did you ever hear of the harbour master?" he asked maliciously. "Which harbour master?" I inquired. "You'll know before long," he observed with a satisfied glance into perspective. This rather extraordinary observation puzzled me. I waited for him to resume, and, as he did not, I asked him what he meant. "If I knew," he said, "I'd tell you. But, come to think of it, I'd be a fool to go into details with such a scientific man. You'll hear about the harbour master. Perhaps you'll see the harbour master. In that event, I shall be glad to converse with you on the subject." I could not help laughing at his prim and precise manner, and, after a moment, he also laughed, saying, "It hurts a man's vanity to know he knows a thing that somebody else knows he doesn't know. I'm damned if I say another word about the harbour master until you've been to Halliard's." "A harbour master," I persisted, "is an official who superintends the moorings of the ships, isn't he?" But he refused to be tempted into conversation, and we lounged silently on the lumber until a long, thin whistle from the locomotive and a rush of stinging salt wind brought us to our feet. Through the trees I could see the bluish-black ocean, stretching out beyond black headlands to meet the clouds. A great wind was roaring among the trees as the train slowly came to a standstill on the edge of the primeval forest. Lee jumped to the ground and aided me with my rifle and pack. And then the train began to back away along a curved side track which, Lee said, led to the mica pit and the company's stores. "Now what will you do?" he asked pleasantly. "I can give you a good dinner and a decent bed tonight if you like, and I'm sure Mrs. Lee would be very glad to have you stop with us as long as you choose." I thanked him, but said that I was anxious to reach Halliard's before dark, and he very kindly led me along the cliffs and pointed out the path. "This man Halliard," he said, "is an invalid. He lives at a cove called Black Harbour, and all his truck goes through to him over the company's road. We receive it here and send a pack mule through once a month. I've met him. He's a bad-tempered hypochondriac, a cynic at heart, and a man whose word is never doubted. If he says he has a great orc, you may be satisfied he has. My heart was beating with excitement at the prospect. I looked out across the wooded headlands and tangled stretches of dune and hollow, trying to realise what it might mean to me, to Professor Farrago, to the world if I should lead back to New York a live orc. "He's a crank," said Lee. "Frankly, I don't like him. If you find it unpleasant there, come back to us." "Does Halliard live alone?" I asked. "Yes, except for a professional trained nurse. Poor thing." "A man?" "No," said Lee disgustedly. Presently he gave me a peculiar glance, hesitated, and finally said, "Ask Halliard to tell you about his nurse and the harbour master. Goodbye. I'm due at the quarry. Come and stay with us whenever you care to. You will find our welcome at Port of Waves." We shook hands and parted on the cliff. He turned back into the forest along the railway. I started northward, pack slung, rifle over my shoulder. Once I met a group of quarrymen, faces burned brick red, scarred hands swinging as they walked, and, as I passed them with a nod, turning, I saw that they also had turned to look after me, and I caught a word or two of their conversation whirled back to me on the sea wind. They were speaking of the harbour master. Chapter 3. Towards sunset, I came out on a sheer granite cliff where the seabirds were whirling and clamouring, and the great breakers dashed, rolling in double-thundered reverberations on the sun-dyed crimson sands below the rock. Across the half-moon of beach towered another cliff, and, beside this, I saw a column of smoke rising in the still air. It certainly came from Halliard's chimney, although the opposite cliff prevented me from seeing the house itself. I rested a moment to refill my pipe, then resumed rifle and pack, and cautiously started to skirt the cliff. I had descended halfway towards the beach and was examining the cliff opposite when something on the very top of the rock arrested my attention. A man darkly outlined against the sky. The next moment, however, I knew it could not be a man, for the object suddenly glided over the face of the cliff and slid down the sheer, smooth-laced like a lizard. Before I could get a square look at it, the thing crawled into the surf, or at least it seemed to. But the whole episode occurred so suddenly, so unexpectedly, that I was not sure I had seen anything at all. However, I was curious enough to climb the cliff on the land side and make my way towards the spot where I imagined I saw the man. Of course, there was nothing there, not a trace of a human being. I mean, something had been there, a sea otter possibly, for the remains of a freshly killed fish lay on the rock, eaten to the backbone and tail. The next moment, below me, I saw the house, a freshly painted, trim, flimsy structure. Modern and very much out of harmony with the splendid savagery surrounding it. It struck a nasty, cheap note in the noble, grey monotony of the headland of the sea. The descent was easy enough. I crossed the crescent beach, hard as pink marble, and found a little trodden path among the rocks that led to the front porch of the house. There were two people on the porch. I heard their voices before I saw them, and when I set my foot upon the wooden steps, I saw one of them, a woman, rise from her chair and step hastily toward me. "Come back," cried the other, a man with a smooth-shaven, deeply lined face and a pair of angry blue eyes, and the woman stepped back quietly, acknowledging my lifted hat with a silent inclination. The man, who was reclining in an invalid's rolling chair, clapped both large, pale hands to the wheels and pushed himself out along the porch. He had shawls pinned about him, an untidy, drab-coloured hat on his head, and when he looked down at me, he scowled. "I know who you are," he said in his acid voice. "You're one of the zoological men from the Bronx Park. You look like it anyway." It is easy to recognise you from your reputation, I replied, irritated at his discourtesy. Really? He replied, with something between a sneer and a laugh. I'm obliged for your frankness. You're after my great orcs, are you not? Nothing else would have tempted me to this place, I replied sincerely. Thank heaven for that, he said. Sit down a moment. You've interrupted us. Then, turning to the young woman who wore the neat gown and tiny cap of a professional nurse, he bade her resume what she had been saying. She did so. With depreciating glance at me, she made the old man sneer again. It happened so suddenly, she said in her low voice, that I had no chance to get back. The boat was drifting in the cove. I sat in the stern, reading, both oars shipped, and the tiller swinging. Then I heard a scratching under the boat, but I thought it might be seaweed. And next moment came these soft thumpings, like the sound of a big fish rubbing its nose against a float. Halliard clutched the wheels of his chair and stared at the girl in grim displeasure. Didn't you know enough to be frightened? He demanded. No, not then, she said, colouring faintly. But when, after a few moments, I looked up and saw the harbour master running up and down the beach, I was horribly frightened. Really, said Halliard sarcastically. It was about time. Then, turning to me, he rasped out, and that young lady was obliged to row all the way to Port of Waves and call to Lee's quarrymen to take her boat in. Completely mystified, I looked from Halliard to the girl, not in the least comprehending what all this meant. That will do, said Halliard ungraciously, which curt phrase was apparently the usual dismal for the nurse. She rose and I rose, and she passed me with an inclination, stepping noiselessly into the house. I want beef tea, bawled Halliard after her. Then he gave me an unamiable glance. I was a well-bred man, he sneered. I'm a Harvard graduate too, but I live as I like, and I do what I like, and I say what I like. You certainly are not reticent, I said, disgusted. Why should I be? He rasped. I pay that young woman for my irritability. It's a bargain between us. In your domestic affairs, I said, there is nothing that interests me. I came here to see those orcs. You probably believe them to be razor-billed orcs, he said contemptuously, but they are not. They are great orcs. I suggested that he permit me to examine them, and he replied indifferently that they were in a pen in his backyard and that I was free to step around the house when I cared to. I laid my rifle and pack on the veranda and hastened off with mixed emotions, among which hope no longer predominated. No man in his senses would keep two such precious prizes in a pen in his backyard, I argued, and I was perfectly prepared to find anything from a puffin to a penguin in that pen. I shall never forget, as long as I live, my stupor of amazement when I came to the wire-covered enclosure. Not only were there two great orcs in the pen, alive, breathing, squatting in bulky majesty on their seaweed bed, but one of them was gravely contemplating two newly hatched chicks, all bill and feet, which nestled sedately at the edge of a puddle of salt water, where some small fish were swimming. For a while excitement blinded, nay deafened me. I tried to realise that I was gazing upon the last individuals of an all but extinct race, the sole survivors of the gigantic orc, which, for 30 years, has been accounted as an extinct creature. I believe I did not move muscle nor limb until the sun had gone down and the crowding darkness blurred my straining eyes and blotted the great, silent, bright-eyed birds from sight. Even then, I could not tear myself away from the enclosure. I listened to the strange, drowsy note of the male bird, the fainter responses of the female, the thin plaints of the chicks huddling under her breast. I heard their flipper-like embryonic wings beating sleepily as the birds stretched and yawned their beaks and clacked them, preparing for slumber. "If you please," came a soft voice from the door, "Mr. Halliard awaits your company to dinner." Chapter 4. I dined well, or, rather, I might have enjoyed my dinner if Mr. Halliard had been eliminated. And the feast consisted exclusively of a joint of beef, the pretty nurse and myself. She was exceedingly attractive, with a disturbing fashion of lowering her head and raising her dark eyes when spoken to. As for Halliard, he was unspeakable, bundled up in his snuffy shawls and making uncouth noises over his gruel. But it is only just to say that his table was worth sitting down to and his wine was sound as a bell. "Yeah," he snapped, "I'm sick of this cursed soup, and I'll trouble you to fill my glass." "It is dangerous for you to touch claret," said the pretty nurse. "I might as well die at dinner as anywhere," he observed. "Certainly," said I, cheerfully passing the decanter, but he did not appear overpleased with the attention. "I can't smoke either," he snarled, hitching the shawls around until he looked like Richard III. However, he was good enough to shove a box of cigars at me, and I took one and stood up, as the pretty nurse slipped past and vanished into the little parlour beyond. We sat there for a while without speaking. He picked irritably at the breadcrumbs on the cloth, never glancing in my direction, and I, tired from my long foot tour, lay back in my chair, silently appreciating one of the best cigars I had ever smoked. "Well," he rasped out at length, "what do you think of my orcs and my veracity?" I told him that both were unimpeachable. "Didn't they call me a swindler down there at your museum?" he demanded. I admitted that I had heard the term applied. Then I made a clean breast of the matter, telling him that it was I who had doubted that my chief, Professor Farrago, had sent me against my will, and that I was ready and glad to admit that he, Mr. Halliard, was a benefactor of the human race. "Bosh," he said. "What good does a confounded wobbly banded toad bird do to the human race?" But he was pleased, nevertheless, and presently he asked me, not unamiably, to punish his claret again. "I'm done for," he said. "Good things to eat and drink are no good to me. Some day I'll get mad enough to have a fit, and then—" He paused to yawn. "Then," he continued, "that little nurse of mine will drink up my claret and go back to civilization where people are polite." Somehow or other, in spite of the fact that Halliard was an old pig, what he said touched me. There was certainly not much left in life for him, as he regarded life. "I'm going to leave her this house," he said, arranging his shawls. "She doesn't know it. I'm going to leave her my money too. She doesn't know that. Good Lord, what kind of a woman can she be to stand my bad temper for a few dollars a month?" "I think," said I, "that it's partly because she's poor, partly because she's sorry for you." He looked up with a ghastly smile. "You think she really is sorry?" Before I could answer, he went on, "I'm no mawkish sentimentalist, and I won't allow anybody to be sorry for me. Do you hear?" "Oh, I'm not sorry for you," I said hastily, and, for the first time since I had seen him, he laughed heartily without a sneer. We both seemed to feel better after that. I drank his wine and smoked his cigars, and he appeared to take a certain grim pleasure in watching me. "There's no fool like a young fool," he observed presently. As I had no doubt he referred to me, I paid him no attention. After fidgeting with his shawls, he gave me an oblique scowl and asked my age. 24, I replied. "Sort of a tadpole, aren't you?" he said. As I took no offence, he repeated the remark. "Oh, come," I said. "There's no use in trying to irritate me. I see through you. A row acts like a cocktail on you, but you'll have to stick to gruel in my company." "I call that impudence," he rasped out wrathfully. "I don't care what you call it," I replied, undisturbed. "I'm not going to be worried by you. Anyway, I ended. It is my opinion that you could be very good company if you chose. The proposition appeared to take his breath away. At least he said nothing more, and I finished my cigar in peace and tossed the stump into a saucer. Now, said I, what price do you set upon your birds, Mr. Halliard? $10,000, he snapped with an evil smile. You will receive a certified cheque when the birds are delivered, I said quietly. You don't mean to say you agree to that outrageous bargain, and I won't take a cent less either. Good Lord! Haven't you any spirit left? He cried, half rising from his pile of shawls. His piteous eagerness for a dispute sent me into a laughter impossible to control, and he eyed me, mouth open, animosity rising visibly. Then he seized the wheels of his invalid chair and trundled away, too mad to speak, and I strolled out into the parlour, still laughing. The pretty nurse was there, sewing under a hanging lamp. If I am not indiscreet, I began. Indiscretion is the better part of valour, she said, dropping her head but raising her eyes. So I sat down with a frivolous smile peculiar to the appreciated. Doubtless, said I, you are hemming a kerchief. Doubtless I am not, she said. This is a nightcap for Mr. Halliard. A mental vision of Halliard in a nightcap, very mad, nearly set me laughing again. Like the king of Yog-Sothoth, he wore his crown in bed, I said flippantly. The king of Yog-Sothoth might have made that remark, she observed, rethreading her needle. It is unpleasant to be reproved. How large and red and hot a man's ears feel. To cool them, I strolled out to the porch, and, after a while, the pretty nurse came out too, and sat down in a chair not far away. She probably regretted her lost opportunity to be flirted with. I have so little company. It is a great relief to see somebody from the world, she said. If you can be agreeable, I wish you would. The idea that she had come out to see me was so agreeable that I remained speechless until she said, Do tell me what people are doing in New York. So I seated myself on the steps and talked about the portion of the world inhabited by me, while she sat sewing in the dull light that straggled out from the parlour windows. She had a certain coquetry of her own, using the usual methods with an individuality that was certainly fetching. For instance, when she lost her needle, and, another time, when we both, on hands and knees, hunted for her thimble. However, directions for these pastimes may be found in contemporary classics. I was as entertaining as I could be. Perhaps not quite as entertaining as a young man usually thinks he is. However, we got on very well together until I asked her tenderly who the harbour master might be, whom they all discussed so mysteriously. I do not care to speak about it, she said, with a primeness of which I had not suspected her capable. Of course, I could scarcely pursue the subject after that, and, indeed, I did not intend to. So I began to tell her how I fancied I had seen a man on the cliff that afternoon, and how the creature slid over the sheer rock like a snake. To my amazement, she asked me to kindly discontinue the account of my adventures in an icy tone, which left no room for protest. It was only a sea otter, I tried to explain, thinking perhaps she did not care for snake stories. But the explanation did not appear to interest her, and I was mortified to observe that my impression upon her was anything but unpleasant. She doesn't seem to like me and my stories, thought I, but she is too young, perhaps, to appreciate them. So I forgave her, for she was even prettier than I had thought her at first, and I took my leave, saying that Mr. Halliard would doubtless direct me to my room. Halliard was in his library, cleaning a revolver, when I entered. Your room is next to mine, he said. Pleasant dreams. And kindly refrain from snoring. May I venture an absurd hope that you will do the same? I replied politely. That maddened him, so I hastily withdrew. I had been asleep for at least 2 hours when a movement by my bedside and a light in my eyes awakened me. I sat bolt upright in bed, blinking at Halliard, who, clad in a dressing gown and wearing a nightcap, had wheeled himself into my room with one hand, while the other hand he solemnly waved a candle over my head. "I'm so cursed lonely," he said. "Come, there's a good fellow. Talk to me in your own original impudent way." I objected strenuously, but he looked so worn and thin, so lonely and bad-tempered, so lovelessly and grotesque, that I got out of bed and passed a spongeful of cold water over my head. Then I returned to bed and propped the pillows up for a backrest, ready to quarrel with him if it might bring some pleasure into his morbid existence. "No," he said amiably, "I'm too worried to quarrel, but I'm much obliged for your kindly offer. I want to tell you something." "What?" I asked suspiciously. "I want to ask if you ever saw a man with gills like a fish." "Gills?" I repeated. "Yes, gills. Did you?" "No," I replied angrily, "and neither did you." "No, I never did," he said in a curiously placid voice, "but there's a man with gills like a fish who lives in the ocean out there. Oh, you needn't look that way. Nobody ever thinks of doubting my word, and I tell you there's a man, or a thing that looks like a man, as big as you are too, all slate-coloured with nasty red gills like a fish. And I've a witness to prove what I say." "Who?" I asked sarcastically. "The witness, my nurse." "Ah, she saw a slate-coloured man with gills?" "Yes, she did. So did Francis Lee, superintendent of the Mica Quarry Company of Porter Waves. So have a dozen men who worked in the quarry. Oh, you needn't laugh, young man. It's an old story here, and anybody can tell you about the harbour master." "The harbour master?" I exclaimed. "Yes, that slate-coloured thing with gills that looks like a man, and, by heaven, is a man. That's the harbour master. Ask any quarryman at Port of Waves what it is that comes purring around their boats at the wharf and unties painters and changes the mooring of every cat boat in the cove at night. Ask Francis Lee what it was he saw running and leaping up and down the shoal at sunset last Friday. Ask anybody along the coast what sort of thing moves about the cliffs like a man and slides over them into the sea like an otter." "I saw it do that," I burst out. "Oh, did you? Well, what was it?" Something kept me silent, although a dozen explanations flew to my lips. After a pause, Halliard said, "You saw the harbour master. That's what you saw." I looked at him without a word. "Don't mistake me," he said, pettishly. "I don't think that the harbour master is a spirit, or a sprite, or a hobgoblin, or any sort of damned rot. Neither do I believe it to be an optical illusion." "What do you think it is?" I asked. "I think it is a man. I think it's a branch of the human race. That's what I think. Let me tell you something. The deepest spot in the Atlantic Ocean is a trifle over 5 miles deep, and I suppose you know that this place lies only about a quarter of a mile off this headland. The British exploring vessel, Gull, Captain Murat, discovered and sounded it. I believe, anyway, it's there, and it's my belief that the profound depths are inhabited by the remnants of the last race of amphibious human beings." This was childish. I did not bother to reply. "Believe it or not as you will," he said angrily. "One thing I know, and that is this. The harbour master has taken to hanging around my cove, and he is attracted by my nurse. I won't have it. I'll blow his fishy gills out of its head if I ever get a shot at him. I don't care whether it's homicide or not. Anyway, it's a new kind of murder, and it attracts me." I gazed at him incredulously, but he was working himself into a passion, and I did not choose to say what I thought. "Yes, this slate-coloured thing that with gills goes purring and grinning and spitting about after my nurse. When she walks, when she rows, when she sits on the beach. Gad, it drives me nearly frantic. I won't tolerate it, I tell you." "No," said I. I wouldn't either. And I rolled over in bed, convulsed with laughter. The next moment, I heard my door slam. I smothered my mirth and rose to close the window, for the land wind blew cold from the forest and a drizzle was sweeping the carpet as far as my bed. That luminous glare which sometimes lingers after the stars go out threw a trembling, nebulous radiance over sand and cove. I heard the seething currents under the breakers, softened thunder, louder than I ever heard it. Then, as I closed my window, lingering for a last look at the crawling tide, I saw a man standing, ankle deep in the surf, all alone there in the night. But was it a man? For the figure suddenly began running over the beach on all fours like a beetle, waving its limbs like feelers. Before I could throw open the window again, it darted into the surf, and when I leaned out into the chilling drizzle, I saw nothing save the flat ebb crawling on the coast. I heard nothing save the purring of bubbles on seething sands. Chapter 5. It took me a week to perfect my arrangements for transporting the great Orcs by water to Port of Waves, where a lumber schooner was to be sent from Petite Saint Isle, chartered by me for a voyage to New York. I had constructed a cage made of osiers, in which my Orcs were to squat until they arrived at Bronx Park. My telegrams to Professor Farrago were brief. One merely said, "Victory." Another explained that I wanted no assistance, and a third read, "Schooner chartered. Arrive New York July 1st. Send furniture van to foot of Bluff Street." My week as a guest of Mr. Halliard proved interesting. I wrangled with that invalid to his heart's content. I worked all day on my osier cage. I hunted the thimble in the moonlight with the pretty nurse. We sometimes found it. As for the thing they called the harbour master, I saw it a dozen times, but always either at night or so far away and so close to the sea that of course no trace of it remained when I reached the spot, rifle in hand. I had quite made up my mind that the so-called harbour master was a demented darky wandered from heaven knows where, perhaps shipwrecked and gone mad from his sufferings. Still, it was far from pleasant to know that the creature was strongly attracted by the pretty nurse. She, however, persisted in regarding the harbour master as a sea creature. She earnestly affirmed that it had gills, like a fish's gills, that it had a soft, fleshy hole for a mouth, and its eyes were luminous and lidless and fixed. Besides, she said with a shudder, it's all slate colour, like a porpoise, and it looks as wet as a sheet of India rubber in a dissecting room. The day before I went to sail with my Orcs in a catboat bound for Port of Waves, Halliard trundled up to me in his chair and announced his intention of going with me. "Going where?" I asked. "To Port of Waves, and then to New York," he replied tranquilly. I was doubtful, and my lack of cordiality hurt his feelings. "Ah, of course, if you need the sea voyage," I began. "I don't. I need you," he said savagely. "I need the stimulus of our daily quarrel. I never disagreed so pleasantly with anybody in my life. It agrees with me. I am 100% better than I was last week." I was inclined to resent this, but something in the deep-lined face of the invalid softened me. Besides, I had taken a hearty liking to the old pig. "I don't want any mawkish sentiment about it," he said, observing me closely. "I won't permit anybody to feel sorry for me. Do you understand?" "I'll trouble you to use a different tone in addressing me," I replied hotly. "I'll feel sorry for you if I choose to." And our usual quarrel proceeded, to his deep satisfaction. By 6 o'clock the next evening, I had Halliard's luggage stowed away in the catboat, and the pretty nurse's effects corded down, with the newly hatched Orc chicks in a hat box on top. She and I placed the osier cage aboard, securing it firmly, and then, throwing tablecloths over the Orcs' heads, we led those simple and dignified birds down the path and across the plank at the little wooden pier. Together we locked up the house, while Halliard stormed at us both and wheeled himself furiously up and down the beach below. At the last moment she forgot her thimble, but we found it. I forget where. "Come on," shouted Halliard, waving his shawls furiously. "What the devil are you about up there?" He received our explanation with a sniff, and we trundled him aboard without further ceremony. "Don't run me across the plank like a steamer trunk," he shouted, as I shot him dexterously into the cockpit. But the wind was dying away, and I had no time to dispute with him then. The sun was setting above the pine-clad ridge as our sail flapped and partly filled, and I cast off, and began a long tack, east by south, to avoid the spouting rocks on our starboard bow. The seabirds rose in clouds as we swung across the shoal. The black surf ducks scattered out to sea. The gulls tossed their sun-tipped wings in the ocean, riding the rollers like bits of froth. Already we were sailing slowly out across that great hole in the ocean, 5 miles deep, the most profound sounding ever taken in the Atlantic. The presence of great heights or great depths, seen or unseen, always impresses the human mind, perhaps oppresses it. We were very silent. The sunlit stain on the cliff and beach deepened to crimson, then faded into sombre purple bloom that lingered long after the rose tint died out in the zenith. Our progress was slow at times, although the sail filled with the rising land breeze, we scarcely seemed to move at all. "Of course," said the pretty nurse, "we couldn't be aground in the deepest hole in the Atlantic." "Scarcely," said Halliard sarcastically, "unless we're grounded on a whale." "What's that soft thumping?" I asked. "Have we run afoul of a barrel or a log?" It was almost too dark to see, but I leaned over the rail and swept the water with my hand. Instantly something smooth glided under it, like the back of a great fish, and I jerked my hand back to the tiller. At the same moment the whole surface of the water seemed to begin to purr, with a sound like the breaking of froth in a champagne glass. "What's the matter with you?" asked Halliard sharply. "A fish came up under my hand," I said. "A porpoise or something." With a low cry, the pretty nurse clasped my arm in both her hands. "Listen," she whispered. "It's purring around the boat." "What the devil's purring?" shouted Halliard. "I won't have anything purring around me." At that moment, to my amazement, I saw that the boat had stopped entirely, although the sail was full and the small pennant fluttered from the masthead. Something, too, was tugging at the rudder, twisting and jerking it until the tiller strained and creaked in my hand. All at once it snapped. The tiller swung useless and the boat whirled around, heeling in the stiffening wind, and drove shoreward. It was then that I, ducking to escape the boom, caught a glimpse of something ahead. Something that a sudden wave seemed to toss on deck and leave there, wet and flapping. A man with round, fixed, fishy eyes and soft, slatty skin. But the horror of the thing were the 2 gills that swelled and relaxed spasmodically, emitting a rasping, purring sound. 2 gasping, blood-red gills, all fluted and scalloped and distended. Frozen with amazement and repugnance, I stared at the creature. I felt the hair stirring on the head and the icy sweat on my forehead. "It's the harbour master," screamed Halliard. The harbour master had gathered himself into a wet lump, squatting motionless in the bows under the mast. His lidless eyes were phosphorescent, like the eyes of living codfish. After a while I felt that either fright or disgust was going to strangle me where I sat. But it was only the arms of the pretty nurse clasped around me in a frenzy of terror. There was not a firearm aboard that we could get at. Halliard's hand crept backward where a steel-shod boat hook lay, and I made a clutch at it. The next moment I had it in my hand and staggered forward, but the boat was already tumbling shoreward among the breakers, and the next I knew the harbour master ran at me like a colossal rat. just as the boat rolled over and over through the surf, spilling freight and passenger among the seaweed-covered rocks. When I came to myself, I was thrashing about knee-deep in a rocky pool, blinded by the water and half suffocated. While under my feet, like a stranded porpoise, the harbour master made the water boil in his efforts to upset me. But his limbs seemed soft and boneless. He had no nails, no teeth, and he bounced and thumped and flapped and splashed like a fish, while I rained blows on him with the boat hook that sounded like blows on a football. And all the while his gills were blowing out and frothing and purring, and his lidless eyes looked into mine, until, nauseated and trembling, I dragged myself back to the beach, where already the pretty nurse alternatively wrung her hands and her petticoats in ornamental despair. Beyond the cove, Halliard was bobbing up and down, afloat in his invalid's chair, trying to steer shoreward. He was the maddest man I ever saw. "Have you killed that rubbery-headed thing yet?" he roared. "I can't kill it," I shouted breathlessly. "I might as well try to kill a football." "Can't you punch a hole in it?" he bawled. "If only I can get at him." His words were drowned in a thunderous splashing, a roar of great, broad flippers beating the sea, and I saw the gigantic forms of my 2 great orcs, followed by their chicks, blundering past in a shower of spray, driving headlong out into the ocean. "Oh, Lord," I said, "I can't stand that." And for the first time in my life, I fainted peacefully and appropriately at the feet of the pretty nurse. It is within the range of possibility that this story may be doubted. It doesn't matter. Nothing can add to the despair of a man who has lost 2 great orcs. As for Halliard, nothing affects him, except his involuntary sea bath, and that did him so much good that he writes me from the south that he's going on a walking tour through Switzerland, if I'll join him. I might have joined him if he had not married the pretty nurse. I wonder whether... But of course, this is no place for speculation. In regard to the harbour master, you may believe it or not as you choose. But if you hear of any great orcs being found, kindly throw a tablecloth over their heads and notify the authorities at the new Zoological Gardens in Bronx Park, New York. The reward is $10,000.
The Secret in the Tomb by Robert Bloch. The wind howled strangely over a midnight tomb. The moon hung like a golden bat over ancient graves, glaring through the wan mist with its baleful, nyctalopic eye. Terrors not of the flesh might lurk among cedar-shrouded sepulchres or creep unseen amid shadowed cenotaphs, for this was unhallowed ground. But tombs hold strange secrets, and there are mysteries blacker than the night, and more leprous than the moon. It was in search of such a secret that I came, alone and unseen, to my ancestral vault at midnight. My people had been sorcerers and wizards in the olden days, so lay apart from the resting place of other men, here in this moldering mausoleum in a forgotten spot, surrounded only by the graves of those who had been their servants. But not all the servants lay here, for there are those who do not die. On through the mist I pressed, to where the crumbling sepulchre loomed among the brooding trees. The wind rose to torrential violence as I trod the obscure pathway to the vaulted entrance, extinguishing my lantern with malefic fury. Only the moon remained to light my way in a luminance unholy. And thus I reached the nitrous, fungus-bearded portals of the family vault. Here the moon shone upon a door that was not like other doors, a single massive slab of iron, embedded in monumental walls of granite. Upon its outer surface was neither handle, lock nor keyhole, but the whole was covered with carvings portentous of a leering evil, cryptic symbols whose allegorical significance filled my soul with a deeper loathing than mere words can impart. There are things that are not good to look upon, and I did not care to dwell too much in thought on the possible genesis of a mind whose knowledge could create such horrors in concrete form. So in blind and trembling haste I chanted the obscure litany and performed the necessary obeisances demanded in the ritual I had learned, and at their conclusion the cyclopean portal swung open. Within was darkness, deep, funereal, ancient, yet, somehow, uncannily alive. It held a pulsing adumbration, a suggestion of muted, yet purposeful rhythm, and overshadowing all, an air of black, impinging revelation. The simultaneous effect upon my consciousness was one of those reactions misnamed intuitions. I sensed that shadows know queer secrets, and there are some skulls that have reason to grin. Yet I must go on into the tomb of my forebears. Tonight the last of all our line would meet the first. For I was the last. Jeremy Strange had been the first, he who fled from the Orient to seek refuge in centuried Eldertown, bringing with him the loot of many tombs and a secret forever nameless. He was he who had built his sepulchre in the twilight woods where the witch lights gleam, and here he had interred his own remains, shunned in death as he had been in life. But buried with him was a secret, and it was this that I had come to seek. Nor was I the first in so seeking, for my father and his father before me, indeed, the eldest of each generation back to the days of Jeremy Strange himself, had likewise sought that which was so maddeningly described in the wizard's diary, the secret of eternal life after death. The musty yellow tome had been handed down to the elder son of each successive generation, and likewise, so it seemed, the dread atavistic craving for black and accursed knowledge, the thirst for which, coupled with the damnably explicit hints set forth in the warlock's record, had sent every one of my paternal ancestors so bequeathed to a final rendezvous in the night, to seek their heritage within the tomb. What they found, none could say, for none had ever returned. It was, of course, a family secret. The tomb was never mentioned. It had, indeed, been virtually forgotten with the passage of years that had likewise eradicated many of the old legends and fantastic accusations about the first strange that had once been common property in the village. The family, too, had been mercifully spared all knowledge of the curse-ridden end to which so many of its men had come. Their secret delvings into black arts, the hidden library of antique lore and demonological formulae brought by Jeremy from the East, the diary and its secret, all were undreamt of save by the eldest sons. The rest of the line prospered. There had been sea captains, soldiers, merchants, statesmen. Fortunes were won. Many departed from the old mansion on the Cape, so that in my father's time he had lived there alone with the servants and myself. My mother died at my birth, and it was a lonely youth I spent in the great brown house, with a father half crazed by the tragedy of my mother's end, and shadowed by the monstrous secret of our line. It was he who initiated me into the mysteries and arcana to be found amid the shuddery speculations of such blasphemies as the Necronomicon, the Book of Iban, the Kabbalah of Sabbath, and that pinnacle of literary madness, Ludwig Prin's Mysteries of the Worm. There were grim treatises on anthropomancy, necrology, lycanthropical and vampiristic spells and charms, witchcraft, and long, rambling screeds in Arabic, Sanskrit and prehistoric ideography, on which lay the dust of centuries. All these he gave me, and more. There were times when he would whisper strange stories about voyages he had taken in his youth, of islands in the sea, and queer survivals spawning dreams beneath Arctic ice. And one night he told me of the legend, and the tomb in the forest, and together we turned the worm-riddled pages of the iron-bound diary that was hidden in the panel above the chimney corner. I was very young, but not too young to know certain things, and as I swore to keep the secret as so many had sworn before me, I had a queer feeling that the time had come for Jeremy to claim his own. For in my father's somber eyes was the same light of dreadful thirst for the unknown, curiosity, and an inward urge that had glowed in the eyes of all the others before him, previous to the time they had announced their intention of going on a trip or joining up or attending to a business matter. Most of them had waited till their children were grown, or their wives had passed on, but whenever they had left, and whatever their excuse, they had never returned. 2 days later, my father disappeared, after leaving word with the servants that he was spending the week in Boston. Before the month was out there was the usual investigation, and the usual failure. A will was discovered among my father's papers, leaving me as sole heir, but the books and the diary were secure in the secret rooms and panels known now to me alone. Life went on. I did the usual things in the usual way, attended university, traveled, and returned at last to the house on the hill, alone. But with me I carried a mighty determination. I alone could thwart that curse. I alone could grasp the secret that had cost the lives of 7 generations, and I alone must do so. The world had naught to offer one who had spent his youth in the study of the mocking truths that lie beyond the outward beauties of a purposeless existence, and I was not afraid. I dismissed the servants, ceased communication with distant relatives and a few close friends, and spent my days in the hidden chambers amid the elder lore, seeking a solution or a spell of such potency as would serve to dispel forever the mystery of the tomb. 100 times I read and reread that hoary script, the diary whose fiend pen promise had driven men to doom. I searched amid the satanic spells and cabalistic incantations of 1,000 forgotten necromancers, delved into pages of impassioned prophecy, burrowed into secret legendary lore whose written thoughts writhed through me like serpents from the pit. It was in vain. All I could learn was the ceremony by which access could be obtained to the tomb in the wood. 3 months of study had worn me to a wraith, and filled my brain with the diabolic shadows of charnel-spawn knowledge, but that was all. And then, as if in mockery of madness, there had come the call, this very night. I had been seated in the study, pondering upon a maggot-eaten volume of Hierarchus Occultus, when without warning, I felt a tremendous urge keening through my weary brain. It beckoned and allured with unutterable promise, like the mating cry of the Lamia of old, yet at the same time it held an inexorable power whose potence could not be defied or denied. The inevitable was at hand. I had been summoned to the tomb. I must follow the beguiling voice of inner consciousness that was the invitation and the promise, that sounded my soul like the ultra-rhythmic piping of transcosmic music. So I had come, alone and weaponless, to the lonely woods and to that wherein I would meet my destiny. The moon rose redly over the manor as I left, but I did not look back. I saw its reflection in the waters of the brook that crept between the trees, and in its light the water was as blood. Then the fog rose silently from the swamp, and a yellow ghost light rode the sky, beckoning me on from behind the black and bloated trees whose branches, swept by a dismal wind, pointed silently toward the distant tomb. Roots and creepers impeded my feet, vines and brambles restrained my body, but in my ears thundered a chorus of urgency that cannot be described and which could not be delayed, by nature or by man. Now, as I hesitated upon the doorstep, a million idiot voices gibbered an invitation to enter that mortal mind could not withstand. Through my brain resounded the horror of my heritage, the insatiable craving to know the forbidden, to mingle and become one with it. A paean of hell-born music crescendoed in my ears, and earth was blotted out in a mad urge that engulfed all being. I paused no longer upon the threshold. I went in where the smell of death filled the darkness that was like the sun over Yog-Sothoth. The door closed, and then came what? I do not know. I only realized that suddenly I could see and feel and hear, despite darkness, and dankness, and silence. I was in the tomb. Its monumental walls and lofty ceiling were black and bare, lichened by the passage of centuries. In the center of the mausoleum stood a single slab of black marble. Upon it rested a gilded coffin, set with strange symbols, and covered by the dust of ages. I knew instinctively what it must contain, and the knowledge did not serve to put me at my ease. I glanced at the floor, then wished I hadn't. Upon the debris-strewn base beneath the slab lay a ghastly, disarticulated group of mortuary remains, half-fleshed cadavers and desiccated skeletons. When I thought of my father and the others, I was possessed of a sickening dismay. They too had sought, and they had failed. And now I had come, alone, to find that which had brought them to an end unholy and unknown. The secret. The secret in the tomb. Mad eagerness filled my soul. I too would know, I must. As in a dream I swayed to the gilded coffin. A moment I tottered above it, then, with a strength born of delirium, I tore away the paneling and lifted the gilded lid, and then I knew it was no dream, for dreams cannot approach the ultimate horror that was the creature lying within the coffin, that creature with eyes like a midnight demon's, and a face of loathsome delirium that was like the death mask of a devil. It was smiling, too, as it lay there, and my soul shrieked in the tortured realization that it was alive. Then I knew it all, the secret and the penalty paid by those who sought it, and I was ready for death, but horrors had not ceased, for even as I gazed it spoke, in a voice like the hissing of a black slug. And there within the night gloom it whispered the secret, staring at me with ageless, deathless eyes so that I should not go mad before I heard the whole of it. All was revealed, the secret crypts of blackest nightmare where the tomb spawn dwell, and of a price whereby a man may become one with the ghouls, living after death as a devourer in darkness. Such a thing had it become, and from this shunned, accursed tomb had sent the call to the descending generations, that when they came, there might be a ghastly feast whereby it might continue a dread, eternal life. I, it breathed, would be the next to die, and in my heart I knew that it was so. I could not avert my eyes from its accursed gaze, nor free my soul from its hypnotic bondage. The thing on the bier cackled with unholy laughter. My blood froze, for I saw two long, lean arms, like the rotted limbs of a corpse, steal slowly toward my fear-constricted throat. The monster sat up, and even in the clutches of my horror, I realized that there was a dim and awful resemblance between the creature in the coffin and a certain ancient portrait back in the hall. But this was a transfigured reality. Jeremy the man had become Jeremy the ghoul, and I knew that it would do no good to resist. Two claws, cold as flames of icy hell, fastened around my throat, two eyes bored like maggots through my frenzied being, a laughter born of madness alone cachinnated in my ears like the thunder of doom. The bony fingers tore at my eyes and nostrils, held me helpless while yellow fangs champed nearer and nearer to my throat. The world spun, wrapped in a mist of fiery death. Suddenly the spell broke. I wrenched my eyes away from that slavering, evil face, and instantly, like a cataclysmic flash of light, came realization. This creature's power was purely mental, by that alone were my ill-fated kinsmen drawn here, and by that alone were they overcome, but once one were free from the strength of the monster's awful eyes, good God! Was I going to be the victim of a crumbled mummy? My right arm swung up, striking the horror between the eyes. There was a sickening crunch, then dead flesh yielded before my hand as I seized the now faceless lich in my arms and cast it into fragments upon the bone-covered floor. Streaming with perspiration and mumbling in hysteria and terrible revulsion, I saw the moldy fragments move even in a second death. A severed hand crawled across the flagging. Upon musty, shredded fingers, a leg began to roll with the animation of grotesque, unholy life. With a shriek, I cast a lighted match upon that loathsome corpse, and I was still shrieking as I clawed open the portals and rushed out of the tomb and into the world of sanity, leaving behind me a smoldering fire from whose charred heart a terrible voice still faintly moaned its tortured requiem to that which had once been Jeremy Strange. The tomb is raised now, and with it the forest graves and all the hidden chambers and manuscripts that serve as a reminder of ghoul-ridden memories that can never be forgot. For earth hides a madness and dreams a hideous reality, and monstrous things abide in the shadows of death, lurking and waiting to seize the souls of those who meddle with forbidden things.
Shadows in Zamboula. Chapter 1. A Drum Begins. Peril hides in the house of Arambaksh. The speaker's voice quivered with earnestness, and his lean, black-nailed fingers clawed at Conan's mightily muscled arm as he croaked his warning. He was a wiry, sunburnt man with a straggling black beard, and his ragged garments proclaimed him a nomad. He looked smaller and meaner than ever in contrast to the giant Cimmerian with his black brows, broad chest, and powerful limbs. They stood in a corner of the sword-maker's bazaar, and on either side of them flowed past the many-tongued, many-colored stream of the Zamboula streets, which is exotic, hybrid, flamboyant, and clamorous. Conan pulled his eyes back from following a bold-eyed, red-lipped Ghanara, whose short skirt bared her brown thigh at each insolent step, and frowned down at his importunate companion. "What do you mean by peril?" he demanded. The desert man glanced furtively over his shoulder before replying and lowered his voice. "Who can say? But desert men and travelers have slept in the house of Aram Baksh and never been seen or heard of again. What became of them? He swore they rose and went their way, and it is true that no citizen of the city has ever disappeared from his house. But no one saw the travelers again, and men say that goods and equipment recognized as theirs have been seen in the bazaars. If Aram did not sell them, after doing away with their owners, how came they here?" "I have no goods," growled the Cimmerian, touching the shagreen-bound hilt of the broadsword that hung at his hip. "I have even sold my horse." "But it is not always rich strangers who vanish by night from the house of Aram Baksh," chattered the Zuagir. "Nay, poor desert men have slept there, because his score is less than that of the other taverns, and have been seen no more. Once a chief of the Zuagirs whose son had thus vanished complained to the satrap Jungir Khan, who ordered the house searched by soldiers." "And they found a cellar full of corpses?" asked Conan in good-humored derision. "Nay, they found naught, and drove the chief from the city with threats and curses. But—" he drew closer to Conan and shivered. "Something else was found. At the edge of the desert, beyond the houses, there is a clump of palm trees, and within that grove there is a pit, and within that pit have been found human bones, charred and blackened, not once, but many times." "Which proves what?" grunted the Cimmerian. "Aram Baksh is a demon. Nay, in this accursed city, which Stygians built and which Hyrcanians rule, where white, brown, and black folk mingle together to produce hybrids of all unholy hues and breeds, who can tell who is a man and who a demon in disguise? Aram Baksh is a demon in the form of a man. At night he assumes his true guise and carries his guests off into the desert, where his fellow demons from the waste meet in conclave." "Why does he always carry off strangers?" asked Conan skeptically. "The people of the city would not suffer him to slay their people, but they care not for the strangers who follow into his hands. Conan, you are of the West, and know not the secrets of this ancient land. But since the beginning of happenings, the demons of the desert have worshipped Yog, the lord of the empty abodes, with fire that devours human victims. Be warned, you have dwelt for many moons in the tents of the Zuagirs, and you are our brother. Go not to the house of Aram Baksh." "Get out of sight," Conan said suddenly. "Yonder comes a squad of the City Watch. If they see you, they will remember a horse that was stolen from the satrap's stable." The Zuagir gasped and moved convulsively. He ducked between a booth and a stone horse trough, pausing only long enough to chatter. "Be warned, my brother. There are demons in the house of Aram Baksh." Then he darted down a narrow alley and was gone. Conan shifted his broad sword belt to his liking and calmly returned the searching stares directed at him by the squad of watchmen as they swung past. They eyed him curiously and suspiciously, for he was a man who stood out even in such a motley throng as crowded the winding streets of Zamboula. His blue eyes and alien features distinguished him from the eastern swarms, and the straight sword at his hip added point to the racial difference. The watchmen did not accost him, but swung on down the street, while the crowd opened a lane for them. They were Pelishtim, squat, hook-nosed, with blue-black beards sweeping their mailed breasts. Mercenaries hired for work the ruling Turanians considered beneath themselves, and no less hated by the mongrel population for that reason. Conan glanced at the sun, just beginning to dip behind the flat-topped houses on the western side of the bazaar, and hitching once more at his belt, moved off in the direction of Aram Baksh's tavern. With a hillman's stride, he moved through the ever-shifting colors of the streets, where the ragged tunics of whining beggars brushed against the ermine-trimmed khalats of lordly merchants and the pearl-sewn satin of rich courtesans. Giant black slaves slouched along, jostling blue-bearded wanderers from the Shemitish cities, ragged nomads from the surrounding deserts, traders and adventurers from all the lands of the East. The native population was no less heterogeneous. Here, centuries ago, the armies of Stygia had come, carving an empire out of the eastern desert. Zamboula was but a small trading town then, lying amidst a ring of oases, and inhabited by descendants of nomads. The Stygians built it into a city and settled it with their own people, and with Shemite and Cushite slaves. The ceaseless caravans, threading the desert from east to west and back again, brought riches and more mingling of races. Then came the conquering Turanians, riding out of the east to thrust back the boundaries of Stygia. And now, for a generation, Zamboula had been Turan's westernmost outpost, ruled by a Turanian satrap. The babble of a myriad tongues smote on the Cimmerian's ears, as the restless pattern of the Zamboula streets weaved about him, cleft now and then by a squad of clattering horsemen, the tall, supple warriors of Turan, with dark hawk faces, clinking metal and curved swords. The throng scampered from under their horses' hoofs, for they were the lords of Zamboula. But tall, somber Stygians, standing back in the shadows, glowered darkly, remembering their ancient glories. The hybrid population cared little whether the king who controlled their destinies dwelt in dark Kimai or gleaming Agrapur. Jungir Khan ruled Zamboula, and men whispered that Nefertari, the satrap's mistress, ruled Jungir Khan. But the people went their way, flaunting their myriad colors in the streets, bargaining, disputing, gambling, swilling, loving, as the people of Zamboula have done for all the centuries its towers and minarets have lifted over the sands of the Karamun. Bronze lanterns, carved with leering dragons, had been lighted in the streets before Conan reached the house of Aram Baksh. The tavern was the last occupied house on the street, which ran west. A wide garden, enclosed by a wall, where date palms grew thick, separated it from the houses farther east. To the west of the inn stood another grove of palms, through which the street, now become a road, wound out into the desert. Across the road from the tavern stood a row of deserted huts, shaded by straggling palm trees, and occupied only by bats and jackals. As Conan came down the road, he wondered why the beggars, so plentiful in Zamboula, had not appropriated these empty houses for sleeping quarters. The lights ceased some distance behind him. There were no lanterns, except the one hanging from the tavern gate. Only the stars, the soft dust of the road underfoot, and the rustle of the palm leaves in the desert breeze. Aram's gate did not open upon the road, but upon the alley which ran between the tavern and the garden of the date palms. Conan jerked lustily at the rope which depended from the bell beside the lantern, augmenting its clamor by hammering on the iron-bound teakwork gate with the hilt of his sword. A wicket opened in the gate, and a black face peered through. "Open, blast you," requested Conan. "I'm a guest. I've paid Aram for a room, and a room I'll have, by Crom." The black craned his neck to stare into the starlit road behind Conan, but he opened the gate without comment and closed it again behind the Cimmerian, locking and bolting it. The wall was unusually high, but there were many thieves in Zamboula, and a house on the edge of the desert might have to be defended against a nocturnal nomad raid. Conan strode through a garden where great pale blossoms nodded in starlight, and entered the tap room, where a Stygian with the shaven head of a student sat at a table brooding over nameless mysteries, and some nondescripts wrangled over a game of dice in a corner. Aram Baksh came forward, walking softly, a portly man, with a black beard that swept his breast, a jutting hook nose, and small black eyes which were never still. "You wish food?" he asked. "Drink?" "I ate a joint of beef and a loaf of bread at the souk," grunted Conan. "Bring me a tankard of Gazan wine. I've got just enough left to pay for it." He tossed a copper coin on the wine-splashed board. "You did not win at the gaming tables?" "How could I, with only a handful of silver to begin with? I paid you for the room this morning because I knew I'd probably lose. I wanted to be sure I had a roof over my head tonight. I notice nobody sleeps in the streets of Zamboula. The very beggars hunt a niche they can barricade before dark. The city must be full of a particularly bloodthirsty brand of thieves." He gulped the cheap wine with relish, and then followed Aram out of the taproom. Behind him, the players halted their game to stare after him with a cryptic speculation in their eyes. They said nothing, but the Stygian laughed, a ghastly laugh of inhuman cynicism and mockery. The others lowered their eyes uneasily, avoiding one another's glance. The arts studied by a Stygian scholar are not calculated to make him share the feelings of a normal human being. Conan followed Aram down a corridor lighted by copper lamps, and it did not please him to note his host's noiseless tread. Aram's feet were clad in soft slippers, and the hallway was carpeted with thick Turanian rugs. But there was an unpleasant suggestion of stealthiness about the Zamboulan. At the end of the winding corridor, Aram halted at a door, across which a heavy iron bar rested in powerful metal brackets. This Aram lifted and showed the Cimmerian into a well-appointed chamber, the windows of which, Conan instantly noted, were small and strongly set with twisted bars of iron, tastefully gilded. There were rugs on the floor, a couch after the Eastern fashion, and ornately carved stools. It was a much more elaborate chamber than Conan could have procured for the price nearer the center of the city, a fact that had at first attracted him when, that morning, he discovered how slim a purse his roisterings for the past few days had left him. He had ridden into Zamboula from the desert a week before. Aram had lighted a bronze lamp, and he now called Conan's attention to the two doors. Both were provided with heavy bolts. "You may sleep safely tonight, Cimmerian," said Aram, blinking over his bushy beard from the inner doorway. Conan grunted and tossed his naked broadsword on the couch. "Your bolts and bars are strong, but I always sleep with steel by my side." Aram made no reply. He stood fingering his thick beard for a moment as he stared at the grim weapon. Then, silently, he withdrew, closing the door behind him. Conan shot the bolt into place, crossed the room, opened the opposite door, and looked out. The room was on the side of the house that faced the road running west from the city. The door opened into a small court that was enclosed by a wall of its own. The end walls, which shut it off from the rest of the tavern compound, were high and without entrances. But the wall that flanked the road was low, and there was no lock on the gate. Conan stood for a moment in the door, the glow of the bronze lamp behind him, looking down the road to where it vanished among the dense palms. Their leaves rustled together in the faint breeze. Beyond them lay the naked desert. Far up the street, in the other direction, lights gleamed and the noises of the city came faintly to him. Here was only starlight, the whispering of the palm leaves, and beyond that low wall, the dust of the road and the deserted huts thrusting their flat roofs against the low stars. Somewhere beyond the palm groves, a drum began. The garbled warnings of the Zuagir returned to him, seeming somehow less fantastic than they had seemed in the crowded sunlit streets. He wondered again at the riddle of those empty huts. Why did the beggars shun them? He turned back into the chamber, shut the door, and bolted it. The light began to flicker, and he investigated, swearing when he found the palm oil in the lamp was almost exhausted. He started to shout for Aram, then shrugged his shoulders and blew out the light. In the soft darkness, he stretched himself fully clad on the couch, his sinewy hand by instinct searching for and closing on the hilt of his broadsword. Glancing idly at the stars framed in the barred windows, with the murmur of the breeze through the palms in his ears, he sank into slumber with a vague consciousness of the muttering drum out on the desert, the low rumble and mutter of a leather-covered drum, beaten with soft, rhythmic strokes of an open black hand. End of Chapter 1. Shadows in Zamboula. Chapter 2. The Night Skulkers. It was the stealthy opening of a door which awakened the Cimmerian. He did not awake as civilized men do, drowsy and drugged and stupid. He awoke instantly, with a clear mind, recognizing the sound that had interrupted his sleep. Lying there tensely in the dark, he saw the outer door slowly open. In the widening crack of starlit sky, he saw framed a great black bulk, broad, stooping shoulders, and a misshapen head blocked out against the stars. Conan felt the skin crawl between his shoulders. He had bolted that door securely. How could it be opening now, save by supernatural agency? And how could a human being possess a head like that outlined against the stars? All the tales he had heard in the Zuagir tents of devils and goblins came back to bead his flesh with clammy sweat. Now the monster slid noiselessly into the room, with a crouching posture and shambling gait. And a familiar scent assailed the Cimmerian's nostrils, but did not reassure him, since Zuagir legendary represented demons as smelling like that. Noiselessly, Conan coiled his long legs under him. His naked sword was in his right hand, and when he struck, it was as suddenly and murderously as a tiger lunging out of the dark. Not even a demon could have avoided that catapulting charge. His sword met and clove through flesh and bone, and something went heavily to the floor, with a strangling cry. Conan crouched in the dark above it, sword dripping in his hand. Devil or beast or man, the thing was dead there on the floor. He sensed death as any wild thing senses it. He glared through the half-open door into the starlit court beyond. The gate stood open, but the court was empty. Conan shut the door but did not bolt it. Groping in the darkness, he found the lamp and lighted it. There was enough oil in it to burn for a minute or so. An instant later, he was bending over the figure that sprawled on the floor in a pool of blood. It was a gigantic black man, naked but for a loincloth. One hand still grasped a knotty-headed bludgeon. The fellow's kinky wool was built up into horn-like spindles with twigs and dried mud. This barbaric coiffure had given the head its misshapen appearance in the starlight. Provided with a clue to the riddle, Conan pushed back the thick red lips and grunted as he stared down at the teeth filed to points. He understood now the mystery of the strangers who had disappeared from the house of Aram Baksh, the riddle of the black drum thrumming out there beyond the palm groves, and of that pit of charred bones, that pit where strange meat might be roasted under the stars, while black beasts squatted about to glut a hideous hunger. The man on the floor was a cannibal slave from Darfar. There were many of his kind in the city. Cannibalism was not tolerated openly in Zamboula. But Conan knew now why people locked themselves in so securely at night, and why even beggars shun the open alleys and doorless ruins. He grunted in disgust as he visualized brutish black shadows skulking up and down the nighted streets, seeking human prey, and such men as Aram Baksh to open the doors to them. The innkeeper was not a demon, he was worse. The slaves from Darfar were notorious thieves. There was no doubt that some of their pilfered loot found its way into the hands of Aram Baksh, and in return he sold them human flesh. Conan blew out the light, stepped to the door and opened it, and ran his hand over the ornaments on the outer side. One of them was movable and worked the bolt inside. The room was a trap to catch human prey like rabbits. But this time, instead of a rabbit, it had caught a saber-toothed tiger. Conan returned to the other door, lifted the bolt, and pressed against it. It was immovable, and he remembered the bolt on the other side. Aram was taking no chances, either with his victims or the men with whom he dealt. Buckling on his sword belt, the Cimmerian strode out into the court, closing the door behind him. He had no intention of delaying the settlement of his reckoning with Aram Baksh. He wondered how many poor devils had been bludgeoned in their sleep and dragged out of that room and down the road that ran through the shadowed palm groves to the roasting pit. He halted in the court. The drum was still muttering, and he caught the reflection of a leaping red glare through the groves. Cannibalism was more than a perverted appetite with the black men of Darfar. It was an integral element of their ghastly cult. The black vultures were already in conclave, but whatever flesh filled their bellies that night, it would not be his. To reach Aram Baksh, he must climb one of the walls which separated the small enclosure from the main compound. They were high, meant to keep out the man-eaters, but Conan was no swamp-bred black man. His thews had been steeled in boyhood on the sheer cliffs of his native hills. He was standing at the foot of the nearer wall when a cry echoed under the trees. In an instant, Conan was crouching at the gate, glaring down the road. The sound had come from the shadows of the huts across the road. He heard a frantic choking and gurgling, such as might result from a desperate attempt to shriek, with a black hand fastened over the victim's mouth. A close-knit clump of figures emerged from the shadows beyond the huts and started down the road, 3 huge black men carrying a slender, struggling figure between them. Conan caught the glimmer of pale limbs writhing in the starlight, even as, with a convulsive wrench, the captive slipped from the grasp of the brutal fingers and came flying up the road, a supple young woman, naked as the day she was born. Conan saw her plainly before she ran out of the road and into the shadows between the huts. The blacks were at her heels, and back in the shadows the figures merged, and an intolerable scream of anguish and horror rang out. Stirred to red rage by the ghoulishness of the episode, Conan raced across the road. Neither victim nor abductors were aware of his presence until the soft swish of the dust about his feet brought them about, and then he was almost upon them, coming with the gusty fury of a hill wind. 2 of the blacks turned to meet him, lifting their bludgeons, but they failed to estimate properly the speed at which he was coming. One of them was down, disemboweled, before he could strike, and wheeling cat-like, Conan evaded the stroke of the other's cudgel and lashed in a whistling countercut. The black's head flew into the air. The headless body took 3 staggering steps, spurting blood and clawing horribly at the air with groping hands, and then slumped to the dust. The remaining cannibal gave back with a strangled yell, hurling his captive from him. She tripped and rolled in the dust, and the black fled in blind panic toward the city. Conan was at his heels. Fear winged the black feet, but before they reached the easternmost hut, he sensed death at his back and bellowed like an ox in the slaughter yards. "Black dog of hell!" Conan drove his sword between the dusky shoulders with such vengeful fury that the broad blade stood out half its length from the black breast. With a choking cry, the black stumbled headlong, and Conan braced his feet and dragged out his sword as his victim fell. Only the breeze disturbed the leaves. Conan shook his head as a lion shakes its mane, and growled his unsatiated bloodlust. But no more shapes slunk from the shadows, and before the huts the starlit road stretched empty. He whirled at the quick patter of feet behind him, but it was only the girl, rushing to throw herself on him and clasp his neck in a desperate grasp, frantic from terror of the abominable fate she had just escaped. "Easy, girl," he grunted. "You're all right. How did they catch you?" She sobbed something unintelligible. He forgot all about Aram Baksh as he scrutinized her by the light of the stars. She was white, though a very definite brunette, obviously one of Zamboula's many mixed breeds. She was tall, with a slender, supple form, as he was in a good position to observe. Admiration burned in his fierce eyes as he looked down on her splendid bosom and her lithe limbs, which still quivered from fright and exertion. He passed an arm around her flexible waist and said, reassuringly, "Stop shaking, wench. You're safe enough." His touch seemed to restore her shaken sanity. She tossed back her thick, glossy locks and cast a fearful glance over her shoulder, while she pressed closer to the Cimmerian as if seeking security in the contact. "They caught me in the streets," she muttered, shuddering, "lying in wait beneath a dark arch. Black men, like great hulking apes. Set have mercy on me. I shall dream of it." "What were you doing out on the streets this time of night?" he inquired, fascinated by the satiny feel of her sleek skin under his questing fingers. She raked back her hair and stared blankly up into his face. She did not seem aware of his caresses. "My lover," she said. "My lover drove me into the streets. He went mad and tried to kill me. As I fled from him, I was seized by those beasts." "Beauty like yours might drive a man mad," quoth Conan, running his fingers experimentally through her glossy tresses. She shook her head, like one emerging from a daze. She no longer trembled, and her voice was steady. "It was the spite of a priest, of Totrasmek, the high priest of Hanuman, who desires me for himself, the dog." "No need to curse him for that," grinned Conan. "The old hyena has better taste than I thought." She ignored the bluff compliment. She was regaining her poise swiftly. "My lover is a young Turanian soldier. To spite me, Totrasmek gave him a drug that drove him mad. Tonight he snatched up a sword and came at me to slay me in his madness, but I fled from him into the streets. The Negro seized me and brought me to this— What was that?" Conan had already moved. Soundlessly as a shadow he drew her behind the nearest hut, beneath the straggling palms. They stood in tense stillness, while the low mutterings both had heard grew louder until voices were distinguishable. A group of Negroes, some 9 or 10, were coming along the road from the direction of the city. The girl clutched Conan's arm, and he felt the terrified quivering of her supple body against his. Now they could understand the gutturals of the black men. "Our brothers have already assembled at the pit," said one. "We have had no luck. I hope they have enough for us." "Aram promised us a man," muttered another, and Conan mentally promised Aram something. "Aram keeps his word," grunted yet another. "Many a man we have taken from his tavern, but we pay him well. I myself have given him 10 bales of silk I stole from my master. It was good silk by set." The blacks shuffled past, bare, splay feet scuffing up the dust, and their voices dwindled down the road. "Well, for us those corpses are lying behind these huts," muttered Conan. "If they look in Aram's death room, they'll find another. Let's be gone." "Yes, let us hasten," begged the girl, almost hysterical again. My lover is wandering somewhere in the streets alone. The Negroes may take him." "A devil of a custom this is," growled Conan as he led the way toward the city, paralleling the road but keeping behind the huts and straggling trees. "Why don't the citizens clean out these black dogs?" "They are valuable slaves," murmured the girl. "There are so many of them they might revolt if they are denied the flesh for which they lust. The people of Zamboula know they skulk the streets at night, and all are careful to remain within locked doors, except when something unforeseen happens, as it did to me. The blacks prey on anything they catch, but they seldom catch anybody but strangers. The people of Zamboula are not concerned with the strangers that pass through the city. Such men as Allan sell these strangers to the blacks. He would not dare attempt such a thing with a citizen." Conan spat in disgust, and a moment later led his companion out into the road which was becoming a street, with still unlighted houses on each side. Slinking in the shadows was not congenial to his nature. "Where do you want to go?" he asked. The girl did not seem to object to his arm about her waist. "To my house, to rouse my servants," she answered. "To bid them search for my lover. I do not wish the city, the priests, anyone to know of his madness. He is a young officer with a promising future. Perhaps we can drive this madness from him if we can find him." "If we find him?" rumbled Conan. "What makes you think I want to spend the night scouring the streets for a lunatic?" She cast a quick glance into his face and properly interpreted the gleam in his blue eyes. Any woman could have known that he would follow her wherever she led, for a while at least. But, being a woman, she concealed her knowledge of that fact. "Please," she began with a hint of tears in her voice, "I have no one else to ask for help. You have been kind." "All right," he grunted. "All right. What's the young reprobate's name?" "Why, Alafdal. I am Zabibi, a dancing girl. I have danced often before the satrap Jongir Khan and his mistress Nefertari, and before all the lords and royal ladies of Zamboula. Thothras-Mek desired me, and because I repulsed him, he made me the innocent tool of his vengeance against Alafdal. I asked a love potion of Thothras-Mek, not suspecting the depth of his guile and hate. He gave me a drug to mix with my lover's wine, and he swore that when Alafdal drank it, he would love me even more madly than ever, and grant me every wish. I mixed the drug secretly with my lover's wine, but having drunk, my lover went raving mad, and things came about as I have told you. Curse Thothras-Mek, the hybrid snake. Ah!" She caught his arm convulsively, and both stopped short. They had come into a district of shops and stalls, all deserted and unlighted, for the hour was late. They were passing an alley, and in its mouth a man was standing, motionless and silent. His head was lowered, but Conan caught the weird gleam of eerie eyes regarding them unblinkingly. His skin crawled, not with fear of the sword in the man's hand, but because of the uncanny suggestion of his posture and silence. They suggested madness. Conan pushed the girl aside and drew his sword. "Don't kill him," she begged. "In the name of Set, do not slay him. You are strong. Overpower him." "We'll see," he muttered, grasping the sword in his right hand and clenching his left into a mallet-like fist. He took a wary step toward the alley, and with a horrible moaning laugh the Turanian charged. As he came, he swung his sword, rising on his toes as he put all the power of his body behind the blows. Sparks flashed blue as Conan parried the blade, and the next instant the madman was stretched senseless in the dust from a thundering buffet of Conan's left fist. The girl ran forward. "Oh, he is not! He is not!" Conan bent swiftly, turning the man on his side, and ran quick fingers over him. "He's not hurt much," he grunted. bleeding at the nose, but anybody's likely to do that after a clout on the jaw. He'll come to after a bit, and maybe his mind will be right. In the meantime, I'll tie his wrists with his sword belt, so. Now, where do you want me to take him?"
"Wait." She knelt beside the senseless figure, seized the bound hands, and scanned them avidly. Then, shaking her head as if in baffled disappointment, she rose. She came close to the giant Cimmerian and laid her slender hands on his arching breast. Her dark eyes, like wet black jewels in the starlight, gazed up into his. "You are a man. Help me. Totrasmek must die. Slay him for me."
"Then put my neck in a Turanian noose?" he grunted.
"Nay."
The slender arms, strong as pliant steel, were around his corded neck. Her supple body throbbed against his.
"The Hyrcanians have no love for Totrasmek. The priests of Set fear him. He is a mongrel who rules men by fear and superstition. I worship Set, and the Turanians bow to Erlek, but Totrasmek sacrifices to Hanuman the Accursed. The Turanian lords fear his black arts and his power over the hybrid population, and they hate him. If he were slain in his temple at night, they would not seek his slayer very closely."
"And what of his magic?" rumbled the Cimmerian.
"You are a fighting man," she answered. "To risk your life is part of your profession."
"For a price," he admitted.
"There will be a price,"
she breathed, rising on tiptoe to gaze into his eyes. The nearness of her vibrant body drove a flame through his veins. The perfume of her breath mounted to his brain. But as his arms closed about her supple figure, she avoided them with a lithe movement, saying,
"Wait. First serve me in this matter."
"Name your price." He spoke with some difficulty.
"Pick up my lover," she directed, and the Cimmerian stooped and swung the tall form easily to his broad shoulder. At the moment he felt as if he could have toppled over Jungir Khan's palace with equal ease. The girl murmured an endearment to the unconscious man, and there was no hypocrisy in her attitude. She obviously loved Alafdal sincerely. Whatever business arrangement she made with Conan would have no bearing on her relationship with Alafdal. Women are more practical about these things than men. "Follow me."
She hurried along the street while the Cimmerian strode easily after her, in no way discomforted by his limp burden. He kept a wary eye out for black shadows skulking under arches, but saw nothing suspicious. Doubtless the men of Darfar were all gathered at the roasting pit. The girl turned down a narrow side street and presently knocked cautiously at an arched door. Almost instantly, a wicket opened in the upper panel, and a black face glanced out. She bent close to the opening, whispering swiftly. Bolts creaked in their sockets, and the door opened. A giant black man stood framed against the soft glow of a copper lamp. A quick glance showed Conan the man was not from Darfar. His teeth were unfiled, and his kinky hair was cropped close to his skull. He was from Wadai. At a word from Zabibi, Conan gave the limp body into the black's arms, and saw the young officer laid on a velvet divan. He showed no signs of returning consciousness. The blow that had rendered him senseless might have felled an ox. Zabibi bent over him for an instant, her fingers nervously twining and twisting. Then she straightened and beckoned the Cimmerian. The door closed softly, the locks clicked behind them, and the closing wicket shut off the glow of the lamps. In the starlight of the street, Zabibi took Conan's hand. Her own hand trembled a little. "You will not fail me?" He shook his maned head, massive against the stars. "Then follow me to Hanuman's shrine, and the gods have mercy on our souls." Along the silent streets they moved like phantoms of antiquity. They went in silence. Perhaps the girl was thinking of her lover lying senseless on the divan under the copper lamps.
or was shrinking with fear of what lay ahead of them in the demon-haunted shrine of Hanuman. The barbarian was thinking only of the woman moving so supplely beside him. The perfume of her scented hair was in his nostrils. The sensuous aura of her presence filled his brain and left room for no other thoughts. Once they heard the clank of brass-shod feet, and drew into the shadows of a gloomy arch while a squad of Pelishtim watchmen swung past. There were 15 of them. They marched in close formation, pikes at the ready, and the rearmost men had their broad brass shields slung on their backs to protect them from a knife stroke from behind. The skulking menace of the black man-eaters was a threat even to armed men. As soon as the clang of their sandals had receded up the street, Conan and the girl emerged from their hiding place and hurried on. A few moments later, they saw the squat, flat-topped edifice they sought looming ahead of them. The temple of Hanuman stood alone in the midst of a broad square, which lay silent and deserted beneath the stars. A marble wall surrounded the shrine, with a broad opening directly before the portico. This opening had no gate or any sort of barrier. "Why don't the blacks seek their prey here?" muttered Conan. "There's nothing to keep them out of the temple." He could feel the trembling of Zabibi's body as she pressed close to him. "They fear Totrasmek, as all in Zamboula fear him, even Jonkir Khan and Nefertari. Come quickly, before my courage flows from me like water." The girl's fear was evident, but she did not falter. Conan drew his sword and strode ahead of her as they advanced through the open gateway. He knew the hideous habits of the priests of the East, and was aware that an invader of Hanuman's shrine might expect to encounter almost any sort of nightmare horror. He knew there was a good chance that neither he nor the girl would ever leave the shrine alive, but he had risked his life too many times before to devote much thought to that consideration. They entered a court paved with marble which gleamed whitely in the starlight. A short flight of broad marble steps led up to the pillared portico. The great bronze doors stood wide open, as they had stood for centuries. But no worshippers burnt incense within. In the day, men and women might come timidly into the shrine and place offerings to the ape god on the black altar. At night, the people shunned the temple of Hanuman as hares shun the lair of the serpent. Burning censers bathed the interior in a soft, weird glow that created an illusion of unreality. Near the rear wall, behind the black stone altar, sat the god with his gaze fixed forever on the open door, through which for centuries his victims had come, dragged by chains of roses. A faint groove ran from the sill to the altar, and when Conan's foot felt it, he stepped away as quickly as if he had trodden upon a snake. That groove had been worn by the faltering feet of the multitude of those who had died screaming on that grim altar. Bestial in the uncertain light, Hanuman leered with his carven mask. He sat, not as an ape would crouch, but cross-legged as a man would sit, but his aspect was no less simian for that reason. He was carved from black marble, but his eyes were rubies, which glowed red and lustful as the coals of hell's deepest pits. His great hands lay upon his lap, palms upward, taloned fingers spread and grasping. In the gross emphasis of his attributes, in the leer of his satyr countenance, was reflected the abominable cynicism of the degenerate cult which deified him. The girl moved around the image, making toward the back wall, when her sleek flank brushed against a carven knee. She shrank aside and shuddered as if a reptile had touched her. There was a space of several feet between the broad back of the idol and the marble wall with its frieze of gold leaves. On either hand, flanking the idol, an ivory door under a gold arch was set in the wall. "Those doors open into each end of a hairpin-shaped corridor," she said hurriedly. Once I was in the interior of the shrine. Once." She shivered and twitched her slim shoulders at a memory both terrifying and obscene. "The corridor is bent like a horseshoe, with each horn opening into this room. Thothras Mech's chambers are enclosed within the curve of the corridor and open into it. But there is a secret door in this wall which opens directly into an inner chamber." She began to run her hands over the smooth surface, where no crack or crevice showed. Conan stood beside her, sword in hand, glancing warily about him. The silence, the emptiness of the shrine, with imagination picturing what might lie behind that wall, made him feel like a wild beast nosing a trap. "Ah!" The girl had found the hidden spring at last. A square opening gaped blackly in the wall. "Sit!" she screamed, and even as Conan leapt toward her, he saw that a great misshapen hand had fastened itself in her hair. She was snatched off her feet and jerked head first through the opening. Conan, grabbing ineffectually at her, felt his fingers slip from a naked limb, and in an instant she had vanished and the wall showed blank as before. Only from beyond it came briefly the muffled sounds of a struggle, a scream faintly heard, and a low laugh that made Conan's blood congeal in his veins. End of Chapter 2. Shadows in Zamboula. Chapter 3. Black Hands Gripping. With an oath, the Cimmerian smote the wall a terrific blow with the pommel of his sword, and the marble cracked and chipped. But the hidden door did not give way, and reason told him that doubtless it had been bolted on the other side of the wall. Turning, he sprang across the chamber to one of the ivory doors. He lifted his sword to shatter the panels, but on a venture tried the door first with his left hand. It swung open easily, and he glared into a long corridor that curved away into dimness under the weird light of censers similar to those in the shrine. A heavy gold bolt showed on the jamb of the door, and he touched it lightly with his fingertips. The faint warmness of the metal could have been detected only by a man whose faculties were akin to those of a wolf. That bolt had been touched, and therefore drawn within the last few seconds. The affair was taking on more and more of the aspect of a baited trap. He might have known Thothras Mech would know when anyone entered the temple. To enter the corridor would undoubtedly be to walk into whatever trap the priest had set for him. But Conan did not hesitate. Somewhere in that dim-lit interior, Zabibi was a captive, and from what he knew of the characteristics of Hanuman's priests, he was sure that she needed help badly. Conan stalked into the corridor with a pantherish tread, poised to strike right or left. On his left, ivory arched doors opened into the corridor, and he tried each in turn. All were locked. He had gone perhaps 75 feet when the corridor bent sharply to the left, describing the curve the girl had mentioned. A door opened into this curve, and it gave under his hand. He was looking into a broad, square chamber, somewhat more clearly lighted than the corridor. Its walls were of white marble, the floor of ivory, the ceiling of fretted silver. He saw divans of rich satin, gold-worked footstools of ivory, a disc-shaped table of some massive metal-like substance. On one of the divans a man was reclining, looking toward the door. He laughed as he met the Cimmerian's startled glare. This man was naked except for a loincloth and high-strapped sandals. He was brown-skinned, with close-cropped black hair and restless black eyes that set off a broad, arrogant face. In girth and breadth he was enormous, with huge limbs on which the great muscles swelled and rippled at each slightest movement. His hands were the largest Conan had ever seen. The assurance of gigantic physical strength colored his every action and inflection. "Why not enter, barbarian?" he called mockingly, with an exaggerated gesture of invitation. Conan's eyes began to smolder ominously, but he trod warily into the chamber, his sword ready. "Who the devil are you?" he growled. "I am Baltior," the man answered. "Once, long ago, and in another land, I had another name. But this is a good name, and why Tutras Mek gave it to me, any temple wench can tell you." "So, you're his dog," grunted Conan. "Well, curse your brown hide, Baltior. Where's the wench you jerked through the wall?" "My master entertains her," laughed Baltior. "Listen." From beyond a door opposite the one by which Conan had entered, there sounded a woman's scream, faint and muffled in the distance. "Blast your soul!" Conan took a stride toward the door, then wheeled with his skin tingling. Baltior was laughing at him, and that laugh was edged with menace that made the hackles rise on Conan's neck and sent a red wave of murder-lust driving across his vision. He started toward Baltior, the knuckles on his sword hand showing white. With a swift motion, the brown man threw something at him, a shining crystal sphere that glistened in the weird light. Conan dodged instinctively, but miraculously the globe stopped short in mid-air, a few feet from his face. It did not fall to the floor. It hung suspended, as if by invisible filaments, some 5 feet above the floor. And as he glared in amazement, it began to rotate with growing speed. And as it revolved, it grew, expanded, became nebulous. It filled the chamber. It enveloped him. It blotted out furniture, walls, the smiling countenance of Baltior. He was lost in the midst of a blinding bluish blur of whirling speed. Terrific winds screamed past Conan, tugging, tearing at him, striving to wrench him from his feet, to drag him into the vortex that spun madly before him. With a choking cry, Conan lurched backward, reeled, felt the solid wall against his back. At the contact, the illusion ceased to be. The whirling, titanic sphere vanished like a bursting bubble. Conan reeled upright in the silver-ceilinged room, with a gray mist coiling about his feet, and saw Baltior lolling on the divan, shaking with silent laughter. "Son of a slut!" Conan lunged at him, but the mist swirled up from the floor, blotting out that giant brown form. Groping in a rolling cloud that blinded him, Conan felt a rending sensation of dislocation. And then room and mist and brown man were gone together. He was standing alone among the high reeds of a marshy fen, and a buffalo was lunging at him, head down. He leapt aside from the ripping scimitar-curved horns and drove his sword in behind the foreleg, through ribs and heart. And then it was not a buffalo dying there in the mud, but the brown-skinned Baltior. With a curse, Conan struck off his head, and the head soared from the ground and snapped beast-like tusks into his throat. For all his mighty strength, he could not tear it loose. He was choking, strangling. Then there was a rush and roar through space, the dislocating shock of an immeasurable impact, and he was back in the chamber with Baltior, whose head was once more set firmly on his shoulders, and who laughed silently at him from the divan. "Mesmerism," muttered Conan, crouching and digging his toes hard against the marble. His eyes blazed. This brown dog was playing with him, making sport of him. But this mummery, this child's play of mists and shadow of thought, it could not harm him. He had but to leap and strike, and the brown acolyte would be a mangled corpse under his heel.
This time he would not be fooled by shadows of illusion, but he was. A blood-curdling snarl sounded behind him, and he wheeled and struck in a flash at the panther crouching to spring on him from the metal-colored table. Even as he struck, the apparition vanished, and his blade clashed deafeningly on the adamantine surface. Instantly he sensed something abnormal. The blade stuck to the table. He wrenched at it savagely. It did not give. This was no mesmeristic trick. The table was a giant magnet. He gripped the hilt with both hands, when a voice at his shoulder brought him about to face the brown man, who had at last risen from the divan. Slightly taller than Conan and much heavier, Baltior loomed before him, a daunting image of muscular development. His mighty arms were unnaturally long, and his great hands opened and closed, twitching convulsively. Conan released the hilt of his imprisoned sword and fell silent, watching his enemy through slitted lids. "Your head, Cimmerian," taunted Baltior. "I shall take it with my bare hands, twisting it from your shoulders as the head of a fowl is twisted. Thus the sons of Kosala offer sacrifice to Yajur. Barbarian, you look upon a strangler of Yotapung. I was chosen by the priests of Yajur in my infancy, and throughout childhood, boyhood, and youth I trained in the art of slaying with the naked hands, for only thus are the sacrifices enacted. Yajur loves blood, and we waste not a drop from the victim's veins. When I was a child, they gave me infants to throttle. When I was a boy, I strangled young girls. As a youth, women, old men, and young boys. Not until I reached my full manhood was I given a strong man to slay on the altar of Yotapung. For years I offered the sacrifices to Yajur. Hundreds of necks have snapped between these fingers." He worked them before the Cimmerian's angry eyes. "Why I fled from Yotapung to become Tothrasmek's servant is no concern of yours. In a moment you will be beyond curiosity. The priests of Kosala, the stranglers of Yajur, are strong beyond belief of men, and I was stronger than any. With my hands, barbarian, I shall break your neck." And, like the stroke of twin cobras, the great hands closed on Conan's throat. The Cimmerian made no attempt to dodge or fend them away, but his own hands darted to the Kosalan's bull neck. Baltior's black eyes widened as he felt the thick cords of muscles that protected the barbarian's throat. With a snarl, he exerted his inhuman strength, and knots and lumps and ropes of thews rose along his massive arms. And then a choking gasp burst from him as Conan's fingers locked on his throat. For an instant, they stood there like statues, their faces masks of effort, veins beginning to stand out purpley on their temples. Conan's thin lips drew back from his teeth in a grinning snarl. Baltior's eyes were distended. In them grew an awful surprise and the glimmer of fear. Both men stood motionless as images, except for the expanding of their muscles on rigid arms and braced legs, but strength beyond common conception was warring there, strength that might have uprooted trees and crushed the skulls of bullocks. The wind whistled suddenly from between Baltior's parted teeth. His face was growing purple. Fear flooded his eyes. His thews seemed ready to burst from his arms and shoulders. Yet the muscles of the Cimmerian's thick neck did not give. They felt like masses of woven iron cords under his desperate fingers. But his own flesh was giving way under the iron fingers of the Cimmerian, which ground deeper and deeper into the yielding throat muscles, crushing them in upon jugular and windpipe. The statuesque immobility of the group gave way to sudden, frenzied motion, as the Kosalan began to wrench and heave, seeking to throw himself backward. He let go of Conan's throat and grasped his wrists, trying to tear away those inexorable fingers. With a sudden lunge,
Conan bore him backward until the small of his back crashed against the table, and still farther over its edge Conan bent him, back and back, until his spine was ready to snap. Conan's low laugh was merciless as the ring of steel. "You fool," he all but whispered. "I think you never saw a man from the West before. Did you deem yourself strong because you were able to twist the heads off civilized folk, poor weaklings with muscles like rotten string? Hell, break the neck of a wild Sumerian bull before you call yourself strong. I did that before I was a full-grown man. Like this." And with a savage wrench, he twisted Baltior's head around until the ghastly face leered over the left shoulder, and the vertebrae snapped like a rotten branch. Conan hurled the flopping corpse to the floor, turned to the sword again, and gripped the hilt with both hands, bracing his feet against the floor. Blood trickled down his broad breast from the wounds Baltior's fingernails had torn in the skin of his neck. His black hair was damp. Sweat ran down his face, and his chest heaved. For all his vocal scorn of Baltior's strength, he had almost met his match in the inhuman Kosalan. But without pausing to catch his breath, he exerted all his strength in a mighty wrench that tore the sword from the magnet where it clung. Another instant, and he had pushed open the door from behind which the scream had sounded, and was looking down a long, straight corridor lined with ivory doors. The other end was masked by a rich velvet curtain, and from beyond that curtain came the devilish strains of such music as Conan had never heard, not even in nightmares. It made the short hairs bristle on the back of his neck. Mingled with it was the panting, hysterical sobbing of a woman. Grasping his sword firmly, he glided down the corridor. End of Chapter 3. Shadows in Zamboula. Chapter 4. Dance, Girl, Dance. When Zabibi was jerked head first through the aperture which opened in the wall behind the idol, her first dizzy, disconnected thought was that her time had come. She instinctively shut her eyes and waited for the blow to fall. But instead she felt herself dumped unceremoniously onto the smooth marble floor, which bruised her knees and hip. Opening her eyes, she stared fearfully around her, just as a muffled impact sounded from beyond the wall. She saw a brown-skinned giant in a loincloth standing over her, and across the chamber into which she had come, a man sat on a divan, with his back to a rich velvet curtain, a broad, fleshy man, with fat white hands and snaky eyes. And her flesh crawled, for this man was Tatrasmek, the priest of Hanuman, who for years had spun his slimy webs of power throughout the city of Zamboula. "The barbarian seeks to batter his way through the wall," said Tatrasmek sardonically, "but the bolt will hold." The girl saw that a heavy golden bolt had been shot across the hidden door, which was plainly discernible from this side of the wall. The bolt and its sockets would have resisted the charge of an elephant. "Go open one of the doors for him, Baltior," ordered Tatrasmek. "Slay him in the square chamber at the other end of the corridor." The Kosalan salaamed and departed by the way of a door in the side wall of the chamber. Zabibi rose, staring fearfully at the priest, whose eyes ran avidly over her splendid figure. To this she was indifferent. A dancer of Zamboula was accustomed to nakedness, but the cruelty in his eyes started her limbs to quivering. "Again you come to me in my retreat, beautiful one," he purred with cynical hypocrisy. "It is an unexpected honor. You seem to enjoy your former visit so little that I dared not hope for you to repeat it. Yet I did all in my power to provide you with an interesting experience." For a Zamboulan dancer to blush would be an impossibility,
but a smolder of anger mingled with the fear in Zabibi's dilated eyes.
"Fat pig, you know I did not come here for love of you."
"No," laughed Totrasmek. "You came like a fool, creeping through the night with a stupid barbarian to cut my throat. Why should you seek my life?"
"You know why," she cried, knowing the futility of trying to dissemble.
"You are thinking of your lover," he laughed. "The fact that you are here seeking my life shows that he quaffed the drug I gave you. Well, did you not ask for it? And did I not send what you asked for, out of the love I bear you?"
"I asked you for a drug that would make him slumber harmlessly for a few hours," she said bitterly. "And you sent your servant with a drug that drove him mad. I was a fool ever to trust you. I might have known your protestations of friendship were lies to disguise your hate and spite."
"Why did you wish your lover to sleep?" he retorted. "So you could steal from him the only thing he would never give you, the ring with the jewel men call the Star of Coralla, the star stolen from the Queen of Ophir, who would pay a roomful of gold for its return. He would not give it to you willingly, because he knew that it holds a magic which, when properly controlled, would enslave the hearts of any of the opposite sex. You wished to steal it from him, fearing that his magicians would discover the key to that magic, and he would forget you in his conquests of the queens of the world. You would sell it back to the Queen of Ophir, who understands its power, and would use it to enslave men, as she did before it was stolen."
"And why did you want it?" she demanded sulkily.
"I understand its powers. It would increase the power of my arts."
"Well," she snapped, "you have it now."
"I have the Star of Coralla? Nay, you err."
"Why bother to lie?" she retorted bitterly. "He had it on his finger when he drove me into the streets. He did not have it when I found him again. Your servant must have been watching the house and have taken it from him after I escaped him. To the devil with it! I want my lover back, sane and whole. You have the ring. You have punished us both. Why do you not restore his mind to him? Can you?"
"I could," he assured her, in evident enjoyment of her distress. He drew a phial from among his robes. "This contains the juice of the golden lotus. If your lover drank it, he would be sane again. Yes, I will be merciful. You have been thwarted and flouted me, not once, but many times. He has constantly opposed my wishes. But I will be merciful. Come and take the phial from my hand." She stared at Totrasmek, trembling with eagerness to seize it, but fearing it was but some cruel jest. She advanced timidly, with a hand extended, and he laughed heartlessly and drew back out of her reach. Even as her lips parted to curse him, some instinct snatched her eyes upward. From the gilded ceiling, 4 jade-hued vessels were falling. She dodged, but they did not strike her. They crashed to the floor about her, forming the 4 corners of a square. And she screamed and screamed again, for out of each ruin reared the hooded head of a cobra, and one struck at her bare leg. Her convulsive movement to evade it brought her within reach of the one on the other side, and again she had to shift like lightning to avoid the flash of its hideous head. She was caught in a frightful trap. All 4 serpents were swaying and striking at foot, ankle, calf, knee, thigh, hip, whatever portion of her voluptuous body chanced to be nearest to them, and she could not spring over them or pass between them to safety. She could only whirl and spring aside and twist her body to avoid the strokes, and each time she moved to dodge one snake, the motion brought her within range of another, so that she had to keep shifting with the speed of light. She could move only a short space in any direction, and the fearful hooded crests were menacing her every second. Only a dancer of Zamboula could have lived in that grisly square. She became herself a blur of bewildering motion. The heads missed her by hair's breadths, but they missed, as she pitted her twinkling feet, flickering limbs, and perfect eye against the blinding speed of the scaly demons her enemy had conjured out of thin air. Somewhere a thin whining music struck up, mingling with the hissing of the serpents, like an evil night wind blowing through the empty sockets of a skull. Even in the flying speed of her urgent haste, she realized that the darting of the serpents was no longer at random. They obeyed the grisly piping of the eerie music. They struck with a horrible rhythm, and perforce her swaying, writhing, spinning body attuned itself to their rhythm. Her frantic motions melted into the measures of a dance compared to which the most obscene tarantella of Zamora would have seemed sane and restrained. Sick with shame and terror, Zabibi heard the hateful mirth of her merciless tormentor. "The dance of the cobras, my lovely one," laughed Tatrasmek. "So maidens danced in the sacrifice to Hanuman centuries ago, but never with such beauty and suppleness. Dance, girl, dance! How long can you avoid the fangs of the poison people? Minutes? Hours? You will weary at last. Your swift, sure feet will stumble, your legs falter, your hips slow in their rotations. Then the fangs will begin to sink deep into your ivory flesh." Behind him, the curtain shook as if struck by a gust of wind, and Tatrasmek screamed. His eyes dilated, and his hands caught convulsively at the length of bright steel which jutted suddenly from his breast. The music broke off short. The girl swayed dizzily in her dance, crying out in dreadful anticipation of the flickering fangs. And then only 4 wisps of harmless blue smoke curled up from the floor about her, as Tatrasmek sprawled headlong from the divan. Conan came from behind the curtain, wiping his broad blade. Looking through the hangings, he had seen the girl dancing desperately between 4 swaying spirals of smoke, but he had guessed that their appearance was very different to her. He knew he had killed Tatrasmek. Zabibi sank down on the floor, panting, but even as Conan started toward her, she staggered up again, though her legs trembled with exhaustion. "The file!" she gasped. "The file!" Tatrasmek still grasped it in his stiffening hand. Ruthlessly, she tore it from his locked fingers, and then began frantically to ransack his garments. "What the devil are you looking for?" Conan demanded. "A ring. He stole it from Alafdal. He must have, while my lover walked in madness through the streets. Set's devils!" She had convinced herself that it was not on the person of Tatrasmek. She began to cast about the chamber, tearing up divan covers and hangings and upsetting vessels. She paused and raked a damp lock of hair out of her eyes. "I forgot Baltior." "He's in hell with his neck broken," Conan assured her. She expressed vindictive gratification at the news, but an instant later swore expressively. "We can't stay here. It's not many hours until dawn. Lesser priests are likely to visit the temple at any hour of the night, and if we are discovered here with his corpse, the people would tear us to pieces. The Turanians could not save us." She lifted the bolt on the secret door, and a few moments later they were in the streets and hurrying away from the silent square where brooded the age-old shrine of Hanuman. In a winding street a short distance away, Conan halted and checked his companion with a heavy hand on her naked shoulder. "Don't forget, there was a price." "I have not forgotten." She twisted free.
But we must go to Alafdal first."
A few minutes later, the black slave let them through the wicket door. The young Turanian lay upon the divan, his arms and legs bound with heavy velvet ropes. His eyes were open, but they were like those of a mad dog, and foam was thick on his lips. Zabibi shuddered.
"Force his jaws open,"
she commanded, and Conan's iron fingers accomplished the task. Zabibi emptied the file down the maniac's gullet. The effect was like magic. Instantly he became quiet. The glare faded from his eyes. He stared up at the girl in a puzzled way, but with recognition and intelligence. Then he fell into a normal slumber.
"When he awakes, he will be quite sane," she whispered, motioning to the silent slave.
With a deep bow, he gave into her hands a small leathern bag, and drew about her shoulders a silken cloak. Her manner had subtly changed when she beckoned Conan to follow her out of the chamber. In an arch that opened on the street, she turned to him, drawing herself up with a new regality.
"I must now tell you the truth," she said. "I am not Zabibi. I am Nafertari, and he is not Alafdal, a poor captain of the guardsmen. He is Jungar Khan, satrap of Zamboula."
Conan made no comment. His scarred, dark countenance was immobile.
"I lied to you because I dared not divulge the truth to anyone," she said. "We were alone when Jongir Khan went mad. None knew of it but myself. Had it been known that the satrap of Zamboula was a madman, there would have been instant revolt and rioting, even as Tatras Mek planned, who plotted our destruction. You see now how impossible is the reward for which you hoped. The satrap's mistress is not, cannot be for you. But you shall not go unrewarded. Here is a sack of gold."
She gave him the bag she had received from the slave.
"Go now, and when the sun is come up to the palace, I will have Jongir Khan make you captain of his guard. But you will take your orders from me secretly. Your first duty will be to march a squad to the shrine of Hanuman, ostensibly to search for clues of the priest slayer. In reality, to search for the star of Korala. It must be hidden there somewhere. When you find it, bring it to me. You have my leave to go now."
He nodded, still silent, and strode away. The girl, watching the swing of his broad shoulders, was piqued to note that there was nothing in his bearing to show that he was in any way chagrined or abashed. When he had rounded a corner, he glanced back, and then changed his direction and quickened his pace. A few moments later, he was in the quarter of the city containing the horse market. There he smote on a door until from the window above a bearded head was thrust to demand the reason for the disturbance. "A horse," demanded Conan. "The swiftest steed you have."
"I open no gates at this time of night," grumbled the horse trader.
Conan rattled his coins.
"Dog's son, knave, don't you see I'm white and alone? Come down before I smash your door."
Presently, on a bay stallion, Conan was riding toward the house of Aram Baksh. He turned off the road into the alley that lay between the tavern compound and the date palm garden, but he did not pause at the gate. He rode on to the northeast corner of the wall, then turned and rode along the north wall, to halt within a few paces of the northwest angle. No trees grew near the wall, but there were some low bushes. To one of these he tied his horse, and was about to climb into the saddle again when he heard a low muttering of voices beyond the corner of the wall. Drawing his foot from the stirrup, he stole to the angle and peered around it. 3 men were moving down the road toward the palm groves, and from their slouching gait he knew they were Negroes. They halted at his low call, bunching themselves as he strode toward them, his sword in his hand. Their eyes gleamed whitely in the starlight. Their brutish lust shone in their ebony faces, but they knew their 3 cudgels could not prevail against his sword, just as he knew it. "Where are you going?" he challenged. "To bid our brothers put out the fire in the pit beyond the groves," was the sullen, guttural reply. "Aram Baksh promised us a man, but he lied. We found one of our brothers dead in the trap chamber. We go hungry this night." "I think not," smiled Conan. "Aram Baksh will give you a man. Do you see that door?" He pointed to a small iron-bound portal set in the midst of the western wall. "Wait there. Aram Baksh will give you a man." Backing warily away until he was out of reach of a sudden bludgeon blow, he turned and melted around the northwest angle of the wall. Reaching his horse, he paused to ascertain that the blacks were not sneaking after him, and then he climbed into the saddle and stood upright on it, quieting the uneasy steed with a low word. He reached up, grasped the coping of the wall, and drew himself up and over. There he studied the grounds for an instant. The tavern was built in the southwest corner of the enclosure, the remaining space of which was occupied by groves and gardens. He saw no one in the grounds. The tavern was dark and silent, and he knew all the doors and windows were barred and bolted. Conan knew that Aram Baksh slept in a chamber that opened into a cypress-bordered path that led to the door in the western wall. Like a shadow, he glided among the trees, and a few moments later he rapped lightly on the chamber door. "What is it?" asked a rumbling voice within.
"Aram Baksh," hissed Conan. "The blacks are stealing over the wall." Almost instantly the door opened, framing the tavern-keeper, naked but for his shirt, with a dagger in his hand. He craned his neck to stare into the Cimmerian's face. "What tale is this? You!" Conan's vengeful fingers strangled a yell in his throat. They went to the floor together, and Conan wrenched the dagger from his enemy's hand. The blade glinted in the starlight, and blood spurted. Akram Baksh made hideous noises, gasping and gagging on a mouthful of blood. Conan dragged him to his feet, and again the dagger slashed, and most of the curly beard fell to the floor. Still gripping his captive's throat, for a man can scream incoherently even with his tongue slit, Conan dragged him out of the dark chamber and down the cypress-shadowed path to the iron-bound door in the outer wall. With one hand he lifted the bolt and threw the door open, disclosing the 3 shadowy figures which waited like black vultures outside. Into their eager arms Conan thrust the innkeeper. A horrible, blood-choked scream rose from the Zamboulan's throat, but there was no response from the silent tavern. The people there were used to screams outside the wall. Aram Baksh fought like a wild man, his distended eyes turned frantically on the Cimmerian's face. He found no mercy there. Conan was thinking of the scores of wretches who owed their bloody doom to this man's greed. In glee, the Negroes dragged him down the road, mocking his frenzied gibberings. How could they recognize Aram Baksh in this half-naked, blood-stained figure, with the grotesquely shorn beard and unintelligible babblings? The sounds of the struggle came back to Conan, standing beside the gate, even after the clump of figures had vanished among the palms. Closing the door behind him, Conan returned to his horse, mounted and turned westward, toward the open desert, swinging wide to skirt the sinister belt of palm groves. As he rode, he drew from his belt a ring in which gleamed a jewel that snarled the starlight in a shimmering iridescence. He held it up to admire it, turning it this way and that. The compact bag of gold pieces clinked gently at his saddle bow like a promise of the greater riches to come. "I wonder what she'd say if she knew I recognized her as Nefertari and him as Jungir Khan the instant I saw them," he mused. "I knew the Star of Kerala, too.
There'll be a fine scene if she ever guesses that I slipped it off his finger while I was tying him with his sword belt. But they'll never catch me with the start I'm getting." He glanced back at the shadowy palm groves, among which a red glare was mounting. A chanting rose to the night, vibrating with savage exultation. And another sound mingled with it, a mad, incoherent screaming, a frenzied gibbering in which no words could be distinguished. The noise followed Conan as he rode westward beneath the paling stars. The end of Shadows in Zamboula by Robert E. Howard.
The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. Son cœur est en luth suspendu, sitôt qu'on la touche il raison. De Béranger. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone, on horseback, through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half-pleasurable, because poetic, sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house, and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveller upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, and an unredeemed dreariness of thought which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. What was it? I paused to think. What was it that so unnerved me in the contemplation of the house of Usher? It was a mystery all insoluble, nor could I grapple with the shadowy fancies that crowded upon me as I pondered. I was forced to fall back upon the unsatisfactory conclusion that while, beyond doubt, there are combinations of very simple natural objects which have the power of thus affecting us, still the analysis of this power lies among considerations beyond our depth. It was possible, I reflected, that a mere different arrangement of the particulars of the scene, of the details of the picture, would be sufficient to modify, or perhaps to annihilate, its capacity for sorrowful impression. And, acting upon this idea, I reined my horse to the precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled lustre by the dwelling, and gazed down, but with a shudder even more thrilling than before, upon the remodelled and inverted images of the grey sedge, and the ghastly tree stems, and the vacant and eye-like windows. Nevertheless, in this mansion of gloom I now proposed to myself a sojourn of some weeks. Its proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions in boyhood, but many years had elapsed since our last meeting. A letter, however, had lately reached me in a distant part of the country, a letter from him, which, in its wildly importunate nature, had admitted of no other than a personal reply. The manuscript gave evidence of nervous agitation. The writer spoke of acute bodily illness, of a mental disorder which oppressed him, and of an earnest desire to see me, as his best and indeed his only personal friend, with the view of attempting, by the cheerfulness of my society, some alleviation of his malady. It was the manner in which all this, and much more, was said. It was the apparent heart that went with his request, which allowed me no room for hesitation, and I accordingly obeyed forthwith what I still considered a very singular summons. Although as boys we had been even intimate associates, yet I really knew little of my friend. His reserve had been always excessive and habitual. I was aware, however, that his very ancient family had been noted time out of mind for a peculiar sensibility of temperament, displaying itself through long ages in many works of exalted art, and manifested of late in repeated deeds of munificent yet unobtrusive charity, as well as in a passionate devotion to the intricacies, perhaps even more to the orthodox and easily recognizable beauties of musical science. I had learned, too, The very remarkable fact that the stem of the Usher race, all time-honored as it was, had put forth at no period any enduring branch. In other words, that the entire family lay in the direct line of descent, and had always, with very trifling and very temporary variation, so lain. It was this deficiency I considered while running over in thought the perfect keeping of the character of the premises with the accredited character of the people, and while speculating upon the possible influence which the one, in the long lapse of centuries, might have exercised upon the other, it was this deficiency perhaps of collateral issue, and the consequent undeviating transmission from sire to son of the patrimony with the name, which had at length so identified the two as to merge the original title of the estate in the quaint and equivocal appellation of the House of Usher, an appellation which seemed to include, in the minds of the peasantry who used it, both the family and the family mansion. I have said that the sole effect of my somewhat childish experiment, that of looking down within the tarn, had been to deepen the first singular impression. There can be no doubt that the consciousness of the rapid increase of my superstition, for why should I not so term it, served mainly to accelerate the increase itself. Such I have long known is the paradoxical law of all sentiments having terror as a basis. And it might have been for this reason only that, when I again uplifted my eyes to the house itself, from its image in the pool there grew in my mind a strange fancy, a fancy so ridiculous indeed that I but mention it to show the vivid force of the sensations which oppressed me. I had so worked upon my imagination as really to believe that about the whole mansion and domain there hung an atmosphere peculiar to themselves and their immediate vicinity, an atmosphere which had no affinity with the air of heaven, but which had reeked up from the decayed trees and the grey wall and the silent tarn, a pestilent and mystic vapour, dull, sluggish, faintly discernible, and leaden-hued. Shaking off from my spirit what must have been a dream, I scanned more narrowly the real aspect of the building. Its principal feature seemed to be that of an excessive antiquity. The discoloration of ages had been great. Minute fungi overspread the whole exterior, hanging in a fine, tangled webwork from the eaves. Yet all this was apart from any extraordinary dilapidation. No portion of the masonry had fallen, and there appeared to be a wild inconsistency between its still perfect adaptation of parts and the crumbling condition of the individual stones. In this there was much that reminded me of the specious totality of old woodwork which has rotted for long years in some neglected vault, with no disturbance from the breath of the external air. Beyond this indication of extensive decay, however, the fabric gave little token of instability. Perhaps the eye of a scrutinizing observer might have discovered a barely perceptible fissure, which, extending from the roof of the building in front, made its way down the wall in a zigzag direction until it became lost in the sullen waters of the tarn. Noticing these things, I rode over a short causeway to the house. A servant in waiting took my horse, and I entered the Gothic archway of the hall. A valet of stealthy step thence conducted me, in silence, through many dark and intricate passages in my progress to the studio of his master. Much that I encountered on the way contributed, I know not how, to heighten the vague sentiments of which I have already spoken, while the objects around me, while the carvings of the ceilings, the sombre tapestries of the walls, the ebony blackness of the floors, and the phantasmagoric armorial trophies which rattled as I strode, were but matters to which, or to such as which, I had been accustomed from my infancy. While I hesitated not to acknowledge how familiar was all this, I still wondered to find how familiar were the fancies which ordinary images were stirring up. On one of the staircases, I met the physician of the family. His countenance, I thought, wore a mingled expression of low cunning and perplexity. He accosted me with trepidation and passed on. The valet now threw open a door and ushered me into the presence of his master. The room in which I found myself was very large and lofty. The windows were long, narrow, and pointed, and at so vast a distance from the black oaken floor as to be altogether inaccessible from within. Feeble gleams of encrimsoned light made their way through the trellised panes, and served to render sufficiently distinct the more prominent objects around. The eye, however, struggled in vain to reach the remoter angles of the chamber, or the recesses of the vaulted and fretted ceiling. Dark draperies hung upon the walls. The general furniture was profuse, comfortless, antique, and tattered. Many books and musical instruments lay scattered about, but failed to give any vitality to the scene. I felt that I breathed an atmosphere of sorrow. An air of stern, deep, and irredeemable gloom hung over and pervaded all. Upon my entrance, Usher rose from a sofa on which he had been lying at full length, and greeted me with a vivacious warmth which had much in it, I at first thought, of an overdone cordiality, of the constrained effort of the ennuyé man of the world. A glance, however, at his countenance convinced me of his perfect sincerity. We sat down, and for some moments while he spoke not, I gazed upon him with a feeling half of pity, half of awe. Surely man had never before so terribly altered in so brief a period as had Roderick Usher. It was with difficulty that I could bring myself to admit the identity of the man being before me with the companion of my early boyhood. Yet the character of his face had been at all times remarkable. A cadaverousness of complexion, an eye large, liquid, and luminous beyond comparison, lips somewhat thin and very pallid, but of a surpassingly beautiful curve, a nose of a delicate Hebrew model, but with a breadth of nostril unusual in similar formations, a finely molded chin, speaking, in its want of prominence, of a want of moral energy, hair of a more than web-like softness and tenuity. These features, with an inordinate expansion above the regions of the temple, made up altogether a countenance not easily to be forgotten. And now, in the mere exaggeration of the prevailing character of these features, and of the expression they were wont to convey, lay so much of change that I doubted to whom I spoke. The now ghastly pallor of the skin, and the now miraculous luster of the eye, above all things startled and even awed me. The silken hair, too, had been suffered to grow all unheeded, and as, in its wild gossamer texture, it floated rather than fell about the face, I could not, even with effort, connect its arabesque expression with any idea of simple humanity. In the manner of my friend I was at once struck with an incoherence, an inconsistency, and I soon found this to arise from a series of feeble and futile struggles to overcome an habitual trepidancy, an excessive nervous agitation. For something of this nature I had indeed been prepared, no less by his letter than by reminiscences of certain boyish traits, and by conclusions deduced from his peculiar physical conformation and temperament. His action was alternately vivacious and sullen. His voice varied rapidly from a tremulous indecision, when the animal spirit seemed utterly in abeyance, to that species of energetic concision, that abrupt, weighty, unhurried, and hollow-sounding enunciation, that leaden, self-balanced, and perfectly modulated guttural utterance, which may be observed in the lost drunkard, or the irreclaimable eater of opium during the periods of his most intense excitement. It was thus that he spoke of the object of my visit, of his earnest desire to see me, and of the solace he expected me to afford him. He entered at some length into what he conceived to be the nature of his malady. It was, he said, a constitutional and a family evil, and one for which he despaired to find a remedy. A mere nervous affection, he immediately added, which would undoubtedly soon pass off. It displayed itself in a host of unnatural sensations. Some of these, as he detailed them, interested and bewildered me, although perhaps the terms and the general manner of the narration had their weight. He suffered much from a morbid acuteness of the senses. The most insipid food was alone endurable. He could wear only garments of certain texture. The odors of all flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured by even a faint light, and there were but peculiar sounds, and these from stringed instruments, which did not inspire him with horror. To an anomalous species of terror I found him a bounden slave. "I shall perish," said he. "I must perish in this deplorable folly. Thus, and not otherwise shall I be lost. I dread the events of the future, not in themselves but in their results. I shudder at the thought of any, even the most trivial incident, which may operate upon this intolerable agitation of soul. I have indeed no abhorrence of danger except in its absolute effect, in terror. In this unnerved, in this pitiable condition, I feel that the period will sooner or later arrive when I must abandon life and reason together, in some struggle with the grim phantasm, fear." I learned, moreover, at intervals and through broken and equivocal hints, another singular feature of his mental condition. He was enchained by certain superstitious impressions in regard to the dwelling which he tenanted, and whence for many years he had never ventured forth. In regard to an influence whose supposititious force was conveyed in terms too shadowy here to be restated, an influence in which some peculiarities in the mere form and substance of his family mansion had, by dint of long sufferance, he said, obtained over his spirit, an effect which the physique of the grey walls and turrets, and of the dim tarn into which they all looked down, had at length brought about upon the morale of his existence. He admitted, however, although with hesitation, that much of the peculiar gloom which thus afflicted him could be traced to a more natural and far more palpable origin, to the severe and long-continued illness, indeed to the evidently approaching dissolution, of a tenderly beloved sister, his sole companion for long years, his last and only relative on earth. Her decease, he said, with a bitterness which I can never forget, would leave him and the hopeless and the frail, the last of the ancient race of the Ushers. While he spoke, the Lady Madeline, for so was she called, passed slowly through a remote portion of the apartment, and without having noticed my presence, disappeared. I regarded her with an utter astonishment, not unmingled with dread, and yet I found it impossible to account for such feelings. A sensation of stupor oppressed me as my eyes followed her retreating steps. When a door at length closed upon her, my glance sought instinctively and eagerly the countenance of the brother, but he had buried his face in his hands, and I could only perceive that a far more than ordinary wanness had overspread the emaciated fingers through which trickled many passionate tears. The disease of the Lady Madeline had long baffled the skill of her physicians. A settled apathy, a gradual wasting away of the person, and frequent although transient affections of a partially cataleptical character were the unusual diagnosis. Hitherto she had steadily borne up against the pressure of her malady, and had not betaken herself finally to bed. But on the closing in of the evening of my arrival at the house, she succumbed, as her brother told me at night with inexpressible agitation, to the prostrating power of the destroyer, and I learned that the glimpse I had obtained of her person would thus probably be the last I should obtain, that the lady, at least while living, would be seen by me no more. For several days ensuing, her name was unmentioned by either Usher or myself, and during this period I was busied in earnest endeavors to alleviate the melancholy of my friend. We painted and read together, or I listened, as if in a dream, to the wild improvisations of his speaking guitar, and thus, as a closer and still closer intimacy admitted me more unreservedly into the recesses of his spirit, the more bitterly did I perceive the futility of all attempt at cheering a mind from which darkness, as if an inherent positive quality, poured forth upon all objects of the moral and physical universe in one unceasing radiation of gloom. I shall ever bear about me a memory of the many solemn hours I thus spent alone with the master of the house of Usher, yet I should fail in any attempt to convey an idea of the exact character of the studies, or of the occupations in which he involved me or led me the way. An excited and highly distempered ideality threw a sulphureous luster over all. His long improvised dirges will ring forever in my ears. Among other things, I hold painfully in mind a certain singular perversion and amplification of the wild air of the last waltz of von Weber. From the paintings over which his elaborate fancy brooded, and which grew, touch by touch, into vagueness at which I shuddered the more thrillingly, because I shuddered knowing not why, from these paintings, vivid as their images now are before me, I would in vain endeavor to adduce more than a small portion which should lie within the compass of merely written words. By the utter simplicity, by the nakedness of his designs, he arrested and overawed attention. If ever mortal painted an idea, that mortal was Roderick Usher. For me, at least, in the circumstances then surrounding me, there arose out of the pure abstractions which the hypochondriac contrived to throw upon his canvas an intensity of intolerable awe, no shadow of which felt I ever yet in the contemplation of the certainly glowing yet too concrete reveries of Fuseli. One of the phantasmagoric conceptions of my friend, partaking not so rigidly of the spirit of abstraction, may be shadowed forth, although feebly, in words. A small picture presented the interior of an immensely long and rectangular vault or tunnel, with low walls, smooth, white, and without interruption or device. Certain accessory points of the design served well to convey the idea that this excavation lay at an exceeding depth below the surface of the earth. No outlet was observed in any portion of its vast extent, and no torch or other artificial source of light was discernible. Yet a flood of intense rays rolled throughout, and bathed the whole in a ghastly and inappropriate splendor. I have just spoken of that morbid condition of the auditory nerve, which rendered all music intolerable to the sufferer, with the exception of certain effects of stringed instruments. It was perhaps the narrow limits to which he thus confined himself upon the guitar which gave birth, in great measure, to the fantastic character of the performances. But the fervid facility of his impromptus could not be so accounted for. They must have been and were in the notes as well as in the words of his wild fantasias, for he not unfrequently accompanied himself with rhymed verbal improvisations, the result of that intense mental collectedness and concentration to which I have previously alluded is observable only in particular moments of the highest artificial excitement. The words of one of these rhapsodies I have easily remembered. I was perhaps the more forcibly impressed with it as he gave it because, in the under or mystic current of its meaning, I fancied that I perceived, and for the first time, a full consciousness on the part of Usher of the tottering of his lofty reason upon her throne. The verses, which were entitled The Haunted Palace, ran very nearly, if not accurately, thus. 1. In the greenest of our valleys, by good angels tenanted, once a fair and stately palace, radiant palace, reared its head, In the monarch thought's dominion, it stood there. Never seraph spread opinion over fabric half so fair. 2. Banners yellow, glorious golden, on its roof did float and flow. This, all this, was in the olden time long ago, and every gentle air that dallied in that sweet day, along the ramparts plumed and pallid, a winged odor went away. 3. Wanderers in that happy valley through 2 luminous windows saw spirits moving musically to a lute's well-tuned law. Round about a throne where sitting, Pole for Regine, in state his glory well befitting, the ruler of the realm was seen. 4. And all with pearl and ruby glowing was the fair palace door, through which came flowing, 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 and sparkling evermore, a troop of echoes whose sweet duty was but to sing, in voices of surpassing beauty, the wit and wisdom of their king. 5. But evil things in robes of sorrow assailed the monarch's high estate. Ah, let us mourn, for never morrow shall dawn upon him desolate. And round about his home the glory that blushed and bloomed is but a dim-remembered story of the old time entombed. 6. And travellers now within that valley through the red-litten windows see vast forms that move fantastically to a discordant melody, while like a rapid ghastly river through the pale door a hideous throng will shout forever and laugh, but smile no more. I well remember that suggestions arising from this ballad led us into a train of thought wherein there became manifest an opinion of Usher's, which I mention not so much on account of its novelty, for other men have thought thus, as on account of the pertinacity with which he maintained it. This opinion, in its general form, was that of the sentience of all vegetable things, but in his disordered fancy, the idea had assumed a more daring character, and trespassed under certain conditions upon the kingdom of inorganization. I lack words to express the full extent, or the earnest abandon of his persuasion. The belief, however, was connected, as I have previously hinted, with the grey stones of the home of his forefathers. The conditions of the sentience had been here, he imagined, fulfilled in the method of collocation of these stones, in the order of their arrangement, as well as in that of the many fungi which overspread them, and of the decayed trees which stood around. Above all, in the long undisturbed endurance of this arrangement, and in its reduplication in the still waters of the tarn. Its evidence, the evidence of the sentience, was to be seen, he said, and I here started as he spoke, in the gradual yet certain condensation of an atmosphere of their own about the waters and the walls. The result was discoverable, he added, in that silent yet importunate and terrible influence which for centuries had moulded the destinies of his family, and which had made him what I now saw him, what he was. Such opinions need no comment, and I will make none. The books which for years had formed no small portion of the mental existence of the invalid were, as might be supposed, in strict keeping with this character of phantasm. We pored together over such works as the Vivere Chartreuse of Grisset, the Belphegor of Machiavelli, the Heaven and Hell of Swedenborg, the Subterranean Voyage of Nicolas Klim by Holberg, the Chiromancy of Robert Flood, of Jean d'Andegenet and of de la Chambre, the Journey into the Blue Distance of Tieck, and the City of the Sun of Campanella. One favorite volume was a small octavo edition of the Directorium Inquisitorium by the Dominican Aymeric de Giron, and there were passages in Pomponius Mela about the old African satyrs and Egyptians, over which Usher would sit dreaming for hours. His chief delight, however, was found in the perusal of an exceedingly rare and curious book in Quarto Gothic, the Manual of a Forgotten Church, the Vigiliae Mortuorum Secundum Coram Ecclesiae Magentinae. I could not help thinking of the wild ritual of this work, and of its probable influence upon the hypochondriac, when one evening, having informed me abruptly that the Lady Madeline was no more, he stated his intention of preserving her corpse for a fortnight, previously to its final interment, in one of the numerous vaults within the main walls of the building. The worldly reason, however, assigned for this singular proceeding was one which I did not feel at liberty to dispute. The brother had been led to his resolution, so he told me, by consideration of the unusual character of the malady of the deceased, of certain unobtrusive and eager inquiries on the part of our medical men, and of the remote and exposed situation of the burial ground of the family. I will not deny that when I called to mind the sinister countenance of the person whom I met upon the staircase on the day of my arrival at the house, I had no desire to oppose what I regarded as at best but a harmless and by no means an unnatural precaution. At the request of Usher, I personally aided him in the arrangements for the temporary entombment. The body having been encoffined, we two alone bore it to its rest. The vault in which we placed it, and which had been so long unopened that our torches, half smothered in its oppressive atmosphere, gave us little opportunity for investigation, was small, damp, and entirely without means of admission for light. Lying at great depth immediately beneath that portion of the building in which was my own sleeping apartment. It had been used apparently in remote feudal times for the worst purposes of a dungeon keep, and in later days as a place of deposit for powder or some other highly combustible substance, as a portion of its floor and the whole interior of a long archway through which we reached it were carefully sheathed with copper. The door of massive iron had been also similarly protected. Its immense weight caused an unusually sharp, grating sound as it moved upon its hinges. Having deposited our mournful burden upon trestles within this region of horror, we partially turned aside the yet unscrewed lid of the coffin, and looked upon the face of the tenant. A striking similitude between the brother and sister now first arrested my attention, and Usher, divining perhaps my thoughts, murmured out some few words from which I learned that the deceased and himself had been twins, and that sympathies of a scarcely intelligible nature had always existed between them. Our glances, however, rested not long upon the dead, for we could not regard her unawed. The disease which had thus entombed the lady in the maturity of youth had left, as usual, in all maladies of a strictly cataleptical character, the mockery of a faint blush upon the bosom and the face, and that suspiciously lingering smile upon the lip which is so terrible in death. We replaced and screwed down the lid, and having secured the door of iron, made our way with toil into the scarcely less gloomy apartments of the upper portion of the house. And now, some days of bitter grief having elapsed, an observable change came over the features of the mental disorder of my friend. His ordinary manner had vanished. His ordinary occupations were neglected or forgotten. He roamed from chamber to chamber with hurried, unequal, and objectless step. The pallor of his countenance had assumed, if possible, a more ghastly hue, but the luminousness of his eye had utterly gone out. The once occasional huskiness of his tone was heard no more, and a tremulous quaver, as if of extreme terror, habitually characterized his utterance. There were times, indeed, when I thought his unceasingly agitated mind was laboring with some oppressive secret, to divulge which he struggled for the necessary courage. At times, again, I was obliged to resolve all into the mere inexplicable vagaries of madness, for I beheld him gazing upon vacancy for long hours in an attitude of the profoundest attention, as if listening to some imaginary sound. It was no wonder that his condition terrified, that it infected me. I felt creeping upon me by slow yet certain degrees the wild influences of his own fantastic yet impressive superstitions. It was especially upon retiring to bed late in the night of the 7th or 8th day after the placing of the Lady Madeline within the dungeon that I experienced the full power of such feelings. Sleep came not near my couch. While the hours waned and waned away, I struggled to reason off the nervousness which had dominion over me. I endeavored to believe that much, if not all of what I felt, was due to the bewildering influence of the gloomy furniture of the room, of the dark and tattered draperies, which, tortured into motion by the breath of a rising tempest, swayed fitfully to and fro upon the walls, and rustled uneasily about the decorations of the bed. But my efforts were fruitless. An irrepressible tremor gradually pervaded my frame, and at length there sat upon my very heart an incubus of utterly causeless alarm. Shaking this off with a gasp and a struggle, I uplifted myself upon the pillows, and, peering earnestly within the intense darkness of the chamber, hearkened, I know not why, except that an instinctive spirit prompted me, to certain low and indefinite sounds which came, through the pauses of the storm, at long intervals I knew not whence. Overpowered by an intense sentiment of horror, unaccountable yet unendurable, I threw on my clothes with haste, for I felt that I should sleep no more during the night, and endeavored to arouse myself from the pitiable condition into which I had fallen, by pacing rapidly to and fro through the apartment. I had taken but few steps in this manner, when a light step on an adjoining staircase arrested my attention. I presently recognized it as that of Usher. In an instant afterward he rapped, with a gentle touch, at my door, and he entered bearing a lamp. His countenance was, as usual, cadaverously wan, but moreover there was a species of mad hilarity in his eyes, an evidently restrained hysteria in his whole demeanor. His air appalled me, but anything was preferable to the solitude which I had so long endured, and I even welcomed his presence as a relief. "And you have not seen it?" he said abruptly, after having stared about him for some moments in silence. "You have not then seen it? But stay, you shall." Thus speaking, and having carefully shaded his lamp, he hurried to one of the casements, and threw it freely open to the storm. The impetuous fury of the entering gust nearly lifted us from our feet. It was indeed a tempestuous yet sternly beautiful night, and one wildly singular in its terror and its beauty. A whirlwind had apparently collected its force in our vicinity, for there were frequent and violent alterations in the direction of the wind, and the exceeding density of the clouds, which hung so low as to press upon the turrets of the house, did not prevent our perceiving the lifelike velocity with which they flew careering from all points against each other without passing away into the distance. I say that even their exceeding density did not prevent our perceiving this. Yet we had no glimpse of the moon or stars, nor was there any flashing forth of the lightning. But the undersurfaces of the huge masses of agitated vapor, as well as all terrestrial objects immediately around us, were glowing in the unnatural light of a faintly luminous and distinctly visible gaseous exhalation which hung about and enshrouded the mansion. "You must not, you shall not behold this," said I, shuddering to Usher as I led him with a gentle violence from the window to a seat. "These appearances, which bewilder you, are merely electrical phenomena not uncommon, or it may be that they have their ghastly origin in the rank miasma of the tarn. Let us close this casement. The air is chilling and dangerous to your frame. Here is one of your favorite romances. I will read and you shall listen, and so we will pass away this terrible night together." The antique volume which I had taken up was The Mad Tryst of Sir Launcelot Canning, but I had called it a favourite of Usher's more in sad jest than in earnest, for in truth there is little in its uncouth and unimaginative prolixity which could have had interest for the lofty and spiritual ideality of my friend. It was, however, the only book immediately at hand, and I indulged a vague hope that the excitement which now agitated the hypochondriac might find relief, for the history of mental disorder is full of similar anomalies, even in the extremeness of the folly which I should read. Could I have judged, indeed, by the wild overstrained air of vivacity with which he hearkened, or apparently hearkened, to the words of the tale, I might well have congratulated myself upon the success of my design. I had arrived at that well-known portion of the story where Ethelred, the hero of the tryst, having sought in vain for peaceable admission into the dwelling of the hermit, proceeds to make good an entrance by force. Here it will be remembered the words of the narrative run thus. "And Ethelred, who was by nature of a doughty heart, and who was now mighty withal, on account of the powerfulness of the wine which he had drunken, waited no longer to hold parley with the hermit, who in sooth was of an obstinate and maliceful turn. But, feeling the rain upon his shoulders, and fearing the rising of the tempest, uplifted his mace outright, and with blows made quickly room in the plankings of the door for his gauntleted hand. And now pulling therewith sturdily, he so cracked and ripped and tore all asunder, that the noise of the dry and hollow-sounding wood alarmed and reverberated throughout the forest." At the termination of this sentence I started, and for a moment paused. For it appeared to me, although I at once concluded that my excited fancy had deceived me, it appeared to me that from some very remote portion of the mansion there came, indistinctly to my ears, what might have been, in its exact similarity of character, the echo, but a stifled and dull one certainly, of the very cracking and ripping sound which Sir Launcelot had so particularly described. It was, beyond doubt, the coincidence alone which had arrested my attention, for amid the rattling of the sashes of the casements, and the ordinary commingled noises of the still increasing storm, the sound in itself had nothing, surely, which should have interested or disturbed me. I continued the story. But the good champion Ethelred, now entering within the door, was sore enraged and amazed to perceive no signal of the maliceful hermit, but in the stead thereof a dragon of the scaly and prodigious demeanour and of a fiery tongue, which sat in guard before a palace of gold, with a floor of silver, and upon the wall there hung a shield of shining brass with this legend enwritten: "Who entereth herein a conqueror hath been, who slayeth the dragon, the shield he shall win." And Ethelred uplifted his mace, and struck upon the head of the dragon, which fell before him, and gave up his pesty breath, with a shriek so horrid and harsh, and withal so piercing, that Ethelred had fain to close his ears with his hands against the dreadful noise of it, the like whereof was never before heard. Here again I paused abruptly, and now with a feeling of wild amazement, for there could be no doubt whatever that in this instance I did actually hear, although from what direction it proceeded I found it impossible to say, a low and apparently distant, but harsh, protracted and most unusual screaming or grating sound, the exact counterpart of what my fancy had already conjured up for the dragon's unnatural shriek as described by the romancer. Oppressed as I certainly was, upon the occurrence of this second and most extraordinary coincidence, by 1,000 conflicting sensations, in which wonder and extreme terror were predominant, I still retained sufficient presence of mind to avoid exciting, by any observation, the sensitive nervousness of my companion. I was by no means certain that he had noticed the sounds in question, although assuredly a strange alteration had, during the last few minutes, taken place in his demeanor. From a position fronting my own, he had gradually brought round his chair so as to sit with his face to the door of the chamber, and thus I could but partially perceive his features, although I saw that his lips trembled, as if he were murmuring inaudibly. His head had dropped upon his breast, yet I knew that he was not asleep, from the wide and rigid opening of the eye as I caught a glance of it in profile. The motion of his body, too, was at variance with this idea, for he rocked from side to side with a gentle yet constant and uniform sway. Having rapidly taken notice of all this, I resumed the narrative of Sir Lancelot, which thus proceeded. And now the champion, having escaped from the terrible fury of the dragon, bethinking himself of the brazen shield, and of the breaking up of the enchantment which was upon it, removed the carcass from out of the way before him, and approached valorously over the silver pavement of the castle to where the shield was upon the wall, which in sooth tarried not for his full coming, but fell down at his feet upon the silver floor with a mighty great and terrible ringing sound. No sooner had these syllables passed my lips than, as if a shield of brass had indeed at the moment fallen heavily upon the floor of silver, I became aware of a distinct, hollow, metallic and clangorous, yet apparently muffled reverberation. Completely unnerved, I leaped to my feet, but the measured rocking movement of Usher was undisturbed. I rushed to the chair in which he sat. His eyes were bent fixedly before him, and throughout his whole countenance there reigned a stony rigidity. But as I placed my hand upon his shoulder, there came a strong shudder over his whole person. A sickly smile quivered about his lips, and I saw that he spoke in a low, hurried, and gibbering murmur, as if unconscious of my presence. Bending closely over him, I at length drank in the hideous import of his words. Not hear it? Yes, I hear it, and have heard it. Long, 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 many minutes, many hours, many days have I heard it, yet I dared not. Oh, pity me, miserable wretch that I am, I dared not speak. We have put her living in the tomb. Said I not that my senses were acute? I now tell you that I heard her first feeble movements in the hollow coffin. I heard them many, many days ago, yet I dared not speak. And now, tonight, Ethelred, the breaking of the hermit's door, and the death cry of the dragon, and the clangor of the shield, say rather the rending of her coffin, and the grating of the iron hinges of her prison, and her struggles within the coppered archway of the vault. Oh, whither shall I fly? Will she not be here anon? Is she not hurrying to upbraid me for my haste? Have I not heard her footstep on the stair? Do I not distinguish that heavy and horrible beating of her heart? Madman! Here he sprang furiously to his feet, and shrieked out his syllables as if in the effort he were giving up his soul. Madman! I tell you that she now stands without the door! As if in the superhuman energy of his utterance there had been found the potency of a spell, the huge antique panels to which the speaker pointed threw slowly back upon the instant their ponderous and ebony jaws. It was the work of the rushing gust, but then without those doors there did stand the lofty and enshrouded figure of the Lady Madeline of Usher. There was blood upon her white robes, and the evidence of some bitter struggle upon every portion of her emaciated frame. For a moment she remained trembling and reeling to and fro upon the threshold. Then, with a low moaning cry, fell heavily inward upon the person of her brother, and in her violent and now final death agonies, bore him to the floor a corpse, and a victim to the terrors he had anticipated. From that chamber and from that mansion I fled aghast. The storm was still abroad in all its wrath as I found myself crossing the old causeway. Suddenly there shot along the path a wild light, and I turned to see whence a gleam so unusual could have issued, for the vast house and its shadows were alone behind me. The radiance was that of the full, setting, and blood-red moon, which now shone vividly through that once barely discernible fissure of which I have before spoken as extending from the roof of the building in a zigzag direction to the base. While I gazed, this fissure rapidly widened. There came a fierce breath of the whirlwind. The entire orb of the satellite burst at once upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. There was a long, tumultuous shouting sound like the voice of 1,000 waters, and the deep and dank tarn at my feet closed sullenly and silently over the fragments of the House of Usher. End of The Fall of the House of Usher.
The Haunted Valley by Ambrose Bierce. 1. How Trees Are Felled in China. A half-mile north from Joe Dunfer's, on the road from Hutton's to Mexican Hill, the highway dips into a sunless ravine which opens out on either hand in a half-confidential manner, as if it had a secret to impart at some more convenient season. I never used to ride through it without looking first to the one side and then to the other, to see if the time had arrived for the revelation. If I saw nothing, and I never did see anything, there was no feeling of disappointment, for I knew the disclosure was merely withheld temporarily for some good reason which I had no right to question. That I should one day be taken into full confidence I no more doubted than I doubted the existence of Joe Dunfer himself, through whose premises the ravine ran. It was said that Joe had once undertaken to erect a cabin in some remote part of it, but for some reason had abandoned the enterprise and constructed his present hermaphrodite habitation, half residence and half groggery, at the roadside, upon an extreme corner of his estate, as far away as possible, as if on purpose to show how radically he had changed his mind. This Joe Dunfer, or, as he was familiarly known in the neighborhood, Whiskey Joe, was a very important personage in those parts. He was apparently about 40 years of age, a long, shock-headed fellow, with a corded face, a gnarled arm, and a knotty hand like a bunch of prison keys. He was a hairy man, with a stoop in his walk, like that of one who is about to spring upon something and rend it. Next to the peculiarity to which he owed his local appellation, Mr. Dunfer's most obvious characteristic was a deep-seated antipathy to the Chinese. I saw him once in a towering rage because one of his herdsmen had permitted a travel-heated Asian to slake his thirst at the horse trough in front of the saloon end of Joe's establishment. I ventured faintly to remonstrate with Joe for his unchristian spirit, but he merely explained that there was nothing about Chinamen in the New Testament, and strode away to wreak his displeasure upon his dog, which also, I suppose, the inspired scribes had overlooked. Some days afterward, finding him sitting alone in his bar-room, I cautiously approached the subject, when, greatly to my relief, the habitual austerity of his expression visibly softened into something that I took for condescension. "You young Easterners," he said, "are a mile and a half too good for this country, and you don't catch on to our play. People who don't know a Chileno from a Kanaka can afford to hang out liberal ideas about Chinese immigration, but a fellow that has to fight for his bone with a lot of mongrel coolies hasn't any time for foolishness." This long consumer, who had probably never done an honest day's work in his life, sprung the lid of a Chinese tobacco box and with thumb and forefinger forked out a wad like a small haycock. Holding this reinforcement within supporting distance, he fired away with renewed confidence. "They're a flight of devouring locusts, and they're going for everything green in this God-blessed land, if you want to know." Here he pushed his reserve into the breach, and when his gabble gear was again disengaged, resumed his uplifting discourse. "I had one of them on this ranch 5 years ago, and I'll tell you about it, so that you can see the nub of this whole question. I didn't pan out particularly well those days, drank more whiskey than was prescribed for me, and didn't seem to care for my duty as a patriotic American citizen, so I took that pagan in, as a kind of cook. But when I got religion over at the Hill and they talked of running me for the legislature, it was given to me to see the light. But what was I to do? If I gave him the go, somebody else would take him, and mightn't treat him white. What was I to do? What would any good Christian do, especially one new to the trade, and full to the neck with the brotherhood of man and the fatherhood of God?" Joe paused for a reply, with an expression of unstable satisfaction, as of one who has solved a problem by a distrusted method. Presently he rose and swallowed a glass of whiskey from a full bottle on the counter, then resumed his story. Besides, he didn't count for much, didn't know anything, and gave himself airs. They all do that. I said him nay, but he muled it through on that line while he lasted. But after turning the other cheek 77 times, I doctored the dice so that he didn't last forever. and I'm almighty glad I had the sand to do it. Joe's gladness, which somehow did not impress me, was duly and ostentatiously celebrated at the bottle. About 5 years ago, I started in to stick up a shack. That was before this one was built, and I put it in another place. I set we and a little cuss named Gopher to cutting the timber. Of course, I didn't expect we to help much, for he had a face like a day in June and big black eyes. I guess maybe they were the damnedest eyes in this neck of woods. While delivering this trenchant thrust at common sense, Mr. Dunfer absently regarded a knothole in the thin board partition separating the bar from the living room, as if that were one of the eyes whose size and color had incapacitated his servant for good service. Now you Eastern galoots won't believe anything against the Yellow Devils, he suddenly flamed out with an appearance of earnestness not altogether convincing. But I tell you that Chink was the perversest scoundrel outside San Francisco. The miserable pigtail Mongolian went to hewing away at the saplings all around the stems, like a worm or the dust gnawing a radish. I pointed out his error as patiently as I knew how, and showed him how to cut them on two sides, so as to make them fall right. But no sooner would I turn my back on him, like this, and he turned it on me, amplifying the illustration by taking some more liquor. Then he was at it again. It was just this way, while I looked at him so, regarding me rather unsteadily and with evident complexity of vision. He was all right, but when I looked away, so, taking a long pull at the bottle, he defied me. Then I'd gaze at him reproachfully, so, and butter wouldn't have melted in his mouth. Doubtless Mr. Dunfer honestly intended the look that he fixed upon me to be merely reproachful, but it was singularly fit to arouse the gravest apprehension in an unarmed person incurring it, and as I had lost all interest in his pointless and interminable narrative, I rose to go. Before I had fairly risen, he had again turned to the counter, and with a barely audible "so," had emptied the bottle at a gulp. Heavens, what a yell! It was like a Titan in this last strong agony. Joe staggered back after emitting it, as a cannon recoils from its own thunder, and then dropped into his chair, as if he had been knocked in the head like a beef, his eyes drawn sidewise toward the wall, with a stare of terror. Looking in the same direction, I saw that the knothole in the wall had indeed become a human eye, a full, black eye, that glared into my own with an entire lack of expression more awful than the most devilish glitter. I think I must have covered my face with my hands to shut out the horrible illusion, if such it was, and Joe's little white man-of-all-work coming into the room broke the spell, and I walked out of the house with a sort of dazed fear that delirium tremens might be infectious. My horse was hitched at the watering trough, and untying him I mounted and gave him his head, too much troubled in mind to know whither he took me. I did not know what to think of all this, and like everyone who does not know what to think, I thought a great deal, and to little purpose. The only reflection that seemed at all satisfactory was that on the morrow I should be some miles away, with a strong probability of never returning. A sudden coolness brought me out of my abstraction, and looking up I found myself entering the deep shadows of the ravine. The day was stifling, and this transition from the pitiless, visible heat of the parched fields to the cool gloom, heavy with pungency of cedars and vocal with twittering of the birds that had been driven to its leafy asylum, was exquisitely refreshing. I looked for my mystery, as usual, but not finding the ravine in a communicative mood, dismounted, led my sweating animal into the undergrowth, tied him securely to a tree, and sat down upon a rock to meditate. I began bravely by analyzing my pet superstition about the place. Having resolved it into its constituent elements, I arranged them in convenient troops and squadrons, and collecting all the forces of my logic, bore down upon them from impregnable premises with the thunder of irresistible conclusions and a great noise of chariots and general intellectual shouting. Then, when my big mental guns had overturned all opposition and were growing almost inaudibly away on the horizon of pure speculation, the routed enemy straggled in upon their rear, massed silently into a solid phalanx, and captured me, bag and baggage. An indefinable dread came upon me. I rose to shake it off and began threading the narrow dell by an old, grass-grown cow-path that seemed to flow along the bottom, as a substitute for the brook that nature had neglected to provide. The trees among which the path straggled were ordinary, well-behaved plants, a trifle perverted as to trunk and eccentric as to bough, but with nothing unearthly in their general aspect. A few loose boulders, which had detached themselves from the sides of the depression to set up an independent existence at the bottom, had dammed up the pathway, here and there, but their stony repose had nothing in it of the stillness of death. There was a kind of death-chamber hush in the valley, it is true, and a mysterious whisper above. The wind was just fingering the tops of the trees, that was all. I had not thought of connecting Joe Dunfer's drunken narrative with what I now sought, and only when I came into a clear space and stumbled over the level trunks of some small trees did I have the revelation. This was the site of the abandoned shack. The discovery was verified by noting that some of the rotting stumps were hacked all around, in a most unwoodmanlike way, while others were cut straight across, and the butt ends of the corresponding trunks had the blunt wedge form given by the axe of a master. The opening among the trees was not more than 30 paces across. At one side was a little knoll, a natural hillock, bare of shrubbery, but covered with wild grass, and on this, standing out of the grass, a headstone of a grave. I do not remember that I felt anything like surprise at this discovery. I viewed that lonely grave with something of the feeling that Columbus must have had when he saw the hills and headlands of the New World. Before approaching it, I leisurely completed my survey of the surroundings. I was even guilty of the affectation of winding my watch at that unusual hour, and with needless care and deliberation. Then I approached my mystery. The grave, a rather short one, was in somewhat better repair than was consistent with its obvious age and isolation, and my eyes, I dare say, widened a trifle at a clump of unmistakable garden flowers showing evidence of recent watering. The stone had clearly enough done duty once as a doorstep. In its front was carved, or rather dug, an inscription. It read thus: Ah Oui, Chinaman. Age unknown, worked for Joe Dunfer. This monument is erected by him to keep the Chink's memory green, likewise as a warning to Celestials not to take on airs. Devil take them. She was a good egg. I cannot adequately relate my astonishment at this uncommon inscription. The meager but sufficient identification of the deceased, the impudent candor of confession, the brutal anathema, the ludicrous change of sex and sentiment, all mark this record as the work of one who must have been at least as much demented as bereaved. I felt that any further disclosure would be a paltry anticlimax, and with an unconscious regard for dramatic effect turned squarely about and walked away, nor did I return to that part of the county for 4 years. 2. Who drives sane oxen should himself be sane. Gee up there, old fuddy-duddy. This unique adjuration came from the lips of a queer little man perched upon a wagon full of firewood, behind a brace of oxen that were hauling it easily along with a simulation of mighty effort which had evidently not imposed on their lord and master. As that gentleman happened at the moment to be staring me squarely in the face as I stood by the roadside, it was not altogether clear whether he was addressing me or his beasts, nor could I say if they were named Fuddy and Duddy, and were both subjects of the imperative mood to gee up. Anyhow, the command produced no effect on us, and the queer little man removed his eyes from mine long enough to spear Fuddy and Duddy alternately with a long pole, remarking, quietly but with feeling, "Durn your skin," as if they enjoyed that integument in common. Observing that my request for a ride took no attention, and finding myself falling slowly astern, I placed one foot upon the inner circumference of a hind wheel and was slowly elevated to the level of the hub. Hence, I boarded the concern, sans ceremony, and scrambling forward seated myself beside the driver, who took no notice of me until he had administered another indiscriminate castigation to his cattle, accompanied with the advice to "buckle down, you derned incapable." Then the master of the outfit, or rather the former master, for I could not suppress a whimsical feeling that the entire establishment was my lawful prize, trained his big, black eyes upon me with an expression strangely, and somewhat unpleasantly, familiar, laid down his rod, which neither blossomed nor turned into a serpent, as I half expected, folded his arms, and gravely demanded, "What did you do to whiskey?" My natural reply would have been that I drank it, but there was something about the query that suggested a hidden significance, and something about the man that did not invite a shallow jest. And so, having no other answer ready, I merely held my tongue, but felt as if I were resting under an imputation of guilt, and that my silence was being construed into a confession. Just then a cold shadow fell upon my cheek, and caused me to look up. We were descending into my ravine. I cannot describe the sensation that came upon me. I had not seen it since it unbosomed itself 4 years before, and now I felt like one to whom a friend has made some sorrowing confession of crime long past, and who has basely deserted him in consequence. The old memories of Joe Dunfer, his fragmentary revelation, and the unsatisfying explanatory note by the headstone came back with singular distinctness. I wondered what had become of Joe, and I turned sharply round and asked my prisoner. He was intently watching his cattle, and without withdrawing his eyes replied, "Gee up, old terrapin. He lies aside of Ah Wee up the gulch. Like to see it? They always come back to the spot. I've been expecting you. Hoa?" At the enunciation of the aspirate, Fuddy-Duddy, the incapable terrapin, came to a dead halt, and before the vowel had died away up the ravine, had folded up all his 8 legs and lain down in the dusty road, regardless of the effect upon his derned skin. The queer little man slid off his seat to the ground and started up the dell without deigning to look back to see if I was following, but I was. It was about the same season of the year, and at near the same hour of the day, of my last visit. The jays clamored loudly, and the trees whispered darkly, as before, and I somehow traced in the two sounds a fanciful analogy to the open boastfulness of Mr. Joe Dunfer's mouth and the mysterious reticence of his manner, and to the mingled hardihood and tenderness of his sole literary production, the epitaph. All things in the valley seemed unchanged, excepting the cow-path, which was almost wholly overgrown with weeds. When we came out into the clearing, however, there was change enough. Among the stumps and trunks of the fallen saplings, those that had been hacked, China fashion, were no longer distinguishable from those that were cut Melican way. It was as if the old world barbarism and the new world civilization had reconciled their differences by the arbitration of an impartial decay, as is the way of civilizations. The knoll was there, but the Hunnish brambles had overrun and all but obliterated its effete grasses, and the patrician garden violet had capitulated to his plebeian brother, perhaps had merely reverted to his original type. Another grave, a long, robust mound, had been made beside the first, which seemed to shrink from the comparison, and in the shadow of a new headstone the old one lay prostrate, with its marvelous inscription illegible by accumulation of leaves and soil. In point of literary merit, the new was inferior to the old, was even repulsive in its terse and savage jocularity. Joe Dunfer. Done for. I turned from it with indifference, and brushing away the leaves from the tablet of the dead pagan restored to light the mocking words which, fresh from their long neglect, seemed to have a certain pathos. My guide, too, appeared to take on an added seriousness as he read it, and I fancied that I could detect beneath his whimsical manner something of manliness, almost of dignity. But while I looked at him, his former aspect, so subtly unhuman, so tantalizingly familiar, crept back into his big eyes, repellent and attractive. I resolved to make an end of the mystery if possible. "My friend," I said, pointing to the smaller grave, "did Joe Dunfer murder that Chinaman?" He was leaning against a tree and looking across the open space into the top of another, or into the blue sky beyond. He neither withdrew his eyes, nor altered his posture as he slowly replied, "No, sir, he justifiably homicided him." "Then he really did kill him?" "Kill him? I should say he did, rather. Doesn't everybody know that? Didn't he stand up before the coroner's jury and confess it? And didn't they find a verdict of, came to his death by a wholesome Christian sentiment working in the Caucasian breast? And didn't the church at the Hill turn whiskey down for it? And didn't the sovereign people elect him justice of the peace to get even on the gospelers? I don't know where you were brought up. But did Joe do that because the Chinaman did not, or would not, learn to cut down trees like a white man? Sure, it stands so on the record, which makes it true and legal. My knowing better doesn't make any difference with legal truth. It wasn't my funeral, and I wasn't invited to deliver an oration. But the fact is, whiskey was jealous of me, and the little wretch actually swelled out like a turkey cock and made a pretense of adjusting an imaginary necktie, noting the effect in the palm of his hand, held up before him to represent a mirror. "Jealous of you?" I repeated with ill-mannered astonishment. "That's what I said. Why not? Don't I look all right?" He assumed a mocking attitude of studied grace and twitched the wrinkles out of his threadbare waistcoat. Then, suddenly dropping his voice to a low pitch of singular sweetness, he continued. "Whiskey thought a lot of that chink. Nobody but me knew how he doted on him. Couldn't bear I'm out of his sight, the derned protoplasm. And we'n come down to this clearing one day and found I'm in me neglecting our work. I'm asleep, and me grappling a tarantula out of his sleeve. Whiskey laid hold of my axe and let us have it. Good and hard. I dodged just then, for the spider bit me, but we got it bad in the side and tumbled about like anything. Whiskey was just weighing me out one when he saw the spider fastened on my finger. Then he knew make a jackass of himself. He threw away the axe and got down on his knees alongside of Awi, who gave a last little kick and opened his eyes. He had eyes like mine, and putting up his hands drew down Whiskey's ugly head and held it there while he stayed. That wasn't long, for a trembling ran through him and he gave a bit of moan and beat the game. During the progress of the story, the narrator had become transfigured. The comic, or rather, the sardonic element was all out of him, and as he painted that strange scene, it was with difficulty that I kept my composure. And this commensurate actor had somehow so managed me that the sympathy due to his dramatis personae was given to himself. I stepped forward to grasp his hand, when suddenly a broad grin danced across his face, and with a light, mocking laugh he continued. When Whiskey got his nut out of that, he was a sight to see. All his fine clothes, he dressed mighty blind in those days, were spoiled everlasting. His hair was tousled, and his face, what I could see of it, was whiter than the ace of lilies. He stared once at me, and looked away as if I didn't count. And then there were shooting pains chasing one another from my bitten finger into my head, and it was gopher to the dark. That why I wasn't at the inquest. But why did you hold your tongue afterward? I asked. It's that kind of tongue, he replied, and not another word would he say about it. After that, whiskey took to drinking harder and harder, and was rabbiter and rabbiter anti-coolie. But I don't think he was ever particularly glad that he dispelled we. He didn't put on so much dog about it when we were alone and when he had the ear of a darn spectacular extravaganza like you. He put up that headstone and gouged the inscription according to his varying moods. It took 3 weeks working between drinks. I gouged his in one day. When did Joe die? I asked rather absently. The answer took my breath. Pretty soon after I looked at through that knothole when you had put something in his whiskey, you darn Borgia. Recovering somewhat from my surprise at this astounding charge, I was half-minded to throttle the audacious accuser, but was restrained by a sudden conviction that came to me in the light of a revelation. I fixed a grave look upon him and asked, as calmly as I could, "And when did you go loony?" 9 years ago, he shrieked, throwing out his clenched hands. 9 years ago, when that big brute killed the woman who loved him better than she did me. Me, who had followed her from San Francisco, where he won her a draw poker. Me, who watched over her for years when the scoundrel she belonged to was ashamed to acknowledge her and treat her white. Me, who for her sake kept his cuss secret till it ate him up. Me, who when you poisoned the beast fulfilled as his last requests to lay alongside her and give a stone to the head and And I've never since seen her grave till now, for I didn't want to meet him here. Meet him? Why, Gopher, my poor fellow, he is dead? That's why I'm afraid of him. I followed the little wretch back to his wagon and wrung his hand at parting. It was now nightfall, and as I stood there at the roadside in the deepening gloom, watching the blank outlines of the receding wagon, a sound was borne to me on the evening wind, a sound as a series of vigorous thumps, and a voice came out of the night. "Gee up there, you derned old geranium." End of The Haunted Valley by Ambrose Bierce. Recorded by Raphael Phoenix Blaze. June 2012, Dallas, Texas.